All right, I'm going to go ahead and call the Joint Revenue Committee to order. I still don't have a functioning laptop, but it's fine. I'll figure it out. So I will go ahead and I want to just read off a couple of housekeeping items. Or should I take roll first? Because I don't have a script. I don't have anything. Russell?
Madam Chair, I'll go ahead and do the roll.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Dennis.
Here.
Senator Severs-Gansert for Senator Tatro.
Here.
Assemblywoman Anderson.
Present.
Assemblywoman Considine.
Present.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Kasama.
Here.
Vice Chair Cohen.
Here.
Chair Neal.
Here. So do we have anyone in Carson City? Or no? We don't have a, okay, Assemblywoman Anderson. All right, thanks. So I just want to do some quick housekeeping items, opening remarks. Please silence all your devices. If you are in Carson City, if there's anyone in Carson City that is planning on speaking for public comment, make sure that you come up to the mic, say your name. When speaking, speak directly into the mic. If you're on the Zoom call and you need to speak, raise your hand or an icon or press *9 on your phone. Also, if you are going to be calling in on the agenda, we have the phone number and fax number for you to call in. Call in and then also to send your remarks to the committee. There is a ledge email for revenue that you can, it's revinterim@lcb.state.nv.us. And if you need to fax your comments over today for the meeting, the number is 775-684-6600. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to open up for public comment. I'll start with Carson City. Is there anyone in Carson City for public comment? No. So then I will come down to Vegas. Anyone signed in for public comment?
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Chris Daly, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. In 2019, hundreds of educators rallied in front of the legislative building calling attention to Nevada's woefully underfunded schools, 47th in per pupil funding at the time. During that session, NSEA called for new revenue, but Democratic majorities took that off the table. NSEA supported SJR 14 to fix Nevada's property tax structure in 2017. However, it failed to even get a hearing in 2019. Instead, the legislature passed SB 543, a new school funding formula with no new revenue. SB 543 created the Commission on School Funding and charged it with recommending funding targets and identifying revenues to fully fund Nevada schools. In April 2021, the Commission published their preliminary recommendations regarding optimal funding, proposing to reach adequate funding by increasing education investment by $2 billion per year within the next 10 years. During the special sessions, and again in 2021, with Nevada dropping to 48th in the country in per pupil funding, hundreds of educators rallied again and again for new revenue. We supported a bold mining tax proposal in AJR 1, several property tax bills, and Senator Neal's SB 346 to establish parity for digital goods. Property tax reforms and the digital goods tax were buried. AJR 1 failed to get a hearing, while a backroom deal was cut with mining. Meanwhile, legislators lauded record education funding as they attempted to cover up the fact that per pupil funding actually decreased in 2021. Now today you will hear a presentation from the Commission on School Funding Chair Guy Hobbs on potential options to generate additional funding from property taxes for K-12 education. Hopefully you will soon also hear the Commission's proposal to expand the sales tax to certain services and digital goods. NSEA has closely followed the work and believes the Commission is sincere in its efforts to raise new revenue. Unfortunately, you may also see political advertisements from the campaigns of both candidates for governor with the slogan, "No new taxes." If recommendations for new revenue are up against a no new taxes pledge, It's unclear why the Commission has been earnestly working on this issue for the last 3 years. Nevada educators are increasingly frustrated and have been leaving in record numbers. We will no longer tolerate political games and misdirection. Adequate funding for schools is long overdue. Unless state leaders make serious progress, things, unfortunately, will only continue to get worse. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else in Vegas that will be coming up for any public comment? Okay, seeing none, is anyone on the phone on BPS for public comment?
Thank you, Chair. To participate in public comment, please press *9 now on your phone to take your place in the queue.
Hello, Kent Urban, ERVIN, Nevada faculty. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Please
Yes,
continue.
Ms.
Okay. Kent Urban, ERVIN, Nevada Faculty Alliance. Good afternoon, Chair Neal and members. Under Agenda Item 6, you're scheduled to hear from the Commission on School Funding on various revenue options to fund K-12 education. If Nevada is to fund K-12 education at an optimal or just adequate level under the per pupil funding plan, without decimating the rest of state government, including higher education, state revenue sources must be broadened and made more stable regardless of the economic cycle. Our economist colleagues tell us that the best taxes are low and broadly applied, reducing the pain for any individual transaction, but covering all sectors of the economy. Currently, only 1/3 of expenditures by the public in Nevada are covered by the sales tax. Broadening the sales tax base would make sense and be more fair and more stable. If the sales tax base were expanded to all of the currently exempt categories, it would bring in billions of revenue. Does it make any sense to tax physical books but not ebooks? Is it fair to tax a factory rebuilt transmission installed in your auto, but not to tax the labor for rebuilding your current transmission? Those should be easy decisions, but limiting the expansion of the sales tax base to just a few categories like digital goods or auto repairs is still targeting relatively small sectors of the overall economy. Including most all services and goods currently exempted could even allow reducing the overall sales tax while increasing revenue, making it less regressive. Exempting non-discretionary items usually also means exempting luxury items within those categories, so people who can afford luxuries are not paying their fair share. It could be more efficient and beneficial to broaden the sales tax base to include all categories, but provide subsidies to those in need, or else give back a per-person rebate to make the sales tax less regressive. You are also hearing today, again, about our peculiar property tax system in Nevada, which creates extra volatility with market cycles because of the depreciation, disparities between owners of older homes and owners of new homes, and loopholes for certain large commercial properties. Modernizing the property tax system will also lead to more stable revenues and a more fair tax system. Your committee has the ability to offer bill draft requests to move forward on modernization and rationalization of the Nevada tax systems. Please don't kick the can down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. BPS, is anyone else on the line?
Chair, your public line is open and working, but you have no more callers at this time.
Okay, thank you. So we will move on to agenda item number 4, which are approval of
Chair.
the minutes. Yes.
This is Michael Nakamoto with the Fiscal Analysis Division. Before we move on to agenda item 4, because you did not have the script, we thought up here that it might be worthwhile to, because although there are members of the committee and presenters both in Carson City and Las Vegas, there still are members of the committee as well as presenters and staff in the Zoom meeting that are participating today. So I thought that it might be worthwhile to remind the members of the committee, the presenters, and the individuals who are in the Zoom meeting that the chat feature is only to be used for technical assistance with BPS and is not to be used for any communication between members, presenters, or other individuals in the meeting unless requesting technical assistance from BPS. And that if somebody uses the chat feature to chat during the meeting, that person would be asked by the chair to read into the record the information posted to the chat and remind everyone that the chat function is to be used exclusively for requesting technical assistance from BPS. And that any links or information that a presenter would like shared during their presentation should be included in their slide deck or other meeting materials provided to the committee and should not be sent to members through the chat feature. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Nakamoto, for that. So I will move on to agenda item number 4, which are approval of the minutes for April 20th, 2022. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from April 20th?
Motion to approve. Second.
So I have a motion from Assemblywoman Kansama. Do I have a second?
Second.
Vice Chair Cohen. All right, so all in favor of approval of the minutes?
Aye.
Could you,
Aye.
I guess, raise your
Aye.
hand so I can? All right, any opposed? Seeing none, approval for the minutes passes. We will now move on to agenda item number 5, which is the presentation on property taxes by the Nevada Assessor Association, and then after that, the Nevada Department of Taxation. So we'll call Miss Brianna Johnson to the dais. All right? Let me know when you're ready.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Brianna Johnson for the record, and I am ready.
Okay, you may proceed.
Okay, so the slide presentation that I have prepared, I'm not sure if everyone can see it or if everyone is looking at the handout. I'm not sure how this screen works or the machine that I'm looking at. Does everyone have the handout, Madam Chair? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So what the assessor does, the assessor is required by Nevada law to discover, list, and value all real and personal property within the county for tax purposes. That is the role of the assessor. Property tax is governed by Nevada Revised Statute 361 and the Nevada Administrative Code 361. As we all know, the assessor does not make the laws. We just follow the laws that are in NRS and NAC 361. Tax roll dates. The secured lien date is July 1. We work by fiscal year, meaning July 1 of 2021 through June 30th of 2022 would equal the fiscal year for 21-22. Our unsecured roll, which is personal property, starts May 1 and closes on April 30th, having the same lien date of July 1 and fiscal year as the secured roll. How we value property in Clark County or in Nevada. NRS 361-227 is the statute that governs us as to how we should value. By law, we cannot exceed market value, and we value vacant land, as you can see, by full cash value. We track sales throughout the year to help us determine what those land values could be, and we improved land consistently with the use to which the improvements are being put. And the taxable value of real property, we are a cost state, so we use the replacement cost from our Marshall & Swift manual, less any applicable depreciation and obsolescence. And the calculated depreciation rate is 1.5% per year up to 50 years, or max depreciation of 75%. Our property valuation formula. So as I mentioned before, land value is based on market. We track sales to help us determine what the land value should be. Our improvement values we refer to as replacement cost new, less depreciation if applicable. Depreciation does not apply to the improvements on the first year they are put onto the tax roll. We take the land value plus the improvement value or replacement cost new, less depreciation, and that gives us a total taxable value. We use the total taxable value to test our values against the market to make sure that we are not exceeding market value. If in fact we are exceeding market value, then that is when we would apply obsolescence to the parcels to make sure that the values are not exceeding market. The property tax calculation formula. Once we have arrived at the taxable value and we are sure that we are following the law and not exceeding market, we are then taking that taxable value times an assessment ratio of 0.35. That gives us the assessed value. The assessed value times the tax rate, and there here in Clark County are about approximately 120 different tax rates depending on where you are within the county. Those rates change. So you take the assessed value times the tax rate, and that's going to give you your taxes as assessed, meaning you do not pay taxes based on your taxable value. Your taxes are calculated at 35% of the taxable value, which is your assessed value. So to give you an example, if the taxable value of a property is $250,000 and we multiply it by the assessment ratio, we get an assessed value of $87,500. That $87,500 is then sent down to the treasurer's office, who calculates taxes. We are on the value side of the equation. We send the value down to the treasurer, they apply the tax rate, and then the taxes are determined. And in this case, the taxes for a $250,000 home that has a taxable value of $250,000, I should say, equates to a tax bill of $2,868.43. Abatements. We have what are called tax cap abatements, which is a residential, could be a residential, owner occupied, or a rental who rents at or below the HUD rates, and that tax cap percentage is 3%. We also have a tax cap abatement for all other property types, which is sometimes referred to as the secondary tax cap, and that tax cap can range from 3% up to 8%. That secondary tax cap changes. We get that secondary tax cap from the Department of Taxation once they calculate what that is. Economic development abatements are another abatement that we have, and then we also have energy abatements, which are green building, renewable energy, and business and facilities that use recycled materials. These are all abatements that our office can apply to properties. The tax abatement law starts with NRS 361-471 through NRS 361-4735. The tax cap came into play in fiscal year 2005-2006. And what this tax cap does, it limits the amount that your taxes can increase from one year to the next year. It is not a cap on value. We continue to value properties according to 361227. The cap is not on value, the cap is on actual taxes. Again, it limits the amount they can increase, whether it is your primary residence or you are at the other or the secondary tax cap. However, new construction or new value added to the tax roll is not eligible for the tax cap until the following year. So to give you an example of that, if we pick up a brand new home for the first time that we've added it to our tax roll, they are not subject to the tax cap because their first tax year sets their base, and then every year after that, they are then allowed the 3 or up to 8% tax cap, depending on the use of the property. Property tax cap abatements are administered by county assessors. Again, they're pursuant to the statutes that are referenced, NRS 361, 4722, 4723, and 4724. This slide just reiterates what those tax cap percentages are. And not only is the 3% on your primary residence, the 3% can also apply to rental properties if you are renting at or below the HUD rates. If you are renting a property and it is above the HUD rates, then it qualifies only for the other or secondary property tax cap. And the other, obviously, property tax cap is up to 8%. It cannot exceed the 8%. The property tax calculation sample. So I'm going to preface this slide by saying that as the assessor, we do not calculate taxes, but for these purposes, we put this slide in here to demonstrate how the tax cap works. Again, we are the value side of the equation, and the treasurer's office calculates taxes for residential properties. So what we have here in year 1, if you look, you'll see a land value of $64,000, assuming that this is the value that the assessors have placed on this particular parcel. Then you have an improvement value of $186,000. Again, this is just for demonstration purposes. Because it is a first-year build, there is no depreciation. So the total taxable value of this property is $250,000. Then we apply the assessment ratio of 35%. We get to our assessed value of $87,500. We take then, or the treasurer will then take that $87,500, multiply it by 100th of this tax rate, and then we get taxes as assessed. So the first year on a new home, because they are not subject to the tax cap, their taxes are considered taxes as assessed. So now we move to year 2. Year 2, things have changed, values have increased, costs have increased. So now you will see that the land value, and again, this is hypothetical, has gone up to $80,000. The improvement value has now increased from $186,000 to $208,000. But now that we are in year 2, the 1.5% depreciation applies. And that is taking the $208,000 times 1.5%. So then we would deduct the $3,120, giving us a total taxable value of $284,880. The assessment ratio again is 0.35, and that gives us an assessed value of $99,708 in value. We send that number down to the treasurer's office. The treasurer then says they have to do it's a process. They first have to calculate taxes as assessed always, meaning the $99,708 times the tax rate, 100th of the tax rate, which gives us $3,268.63. That is taxes as assessed. Now, what the treasurer has to determine is what were the taxes paid last year, which we have determined in year 1, they paid $2868.43. So they take that number and multiply it by 1.03 or 3%, which brings us to $2,954.48. If it is their primary residence and they get the 3% cap. So now we are in column year 2, and the treasurer says, is taxes as assessed or their capped taxes primary, they take the lower of the two. So in this case, the property owner in year 2 would get their tax bill for $2,954.48 instead of the $3,200 because the tax cap is in place. We are going to do it again for the other tax cap. So the treasurer looks back in year 1 and says they paid $2868.43, and they are at the alternative tax cap, secondary tax cap, or the other tax cap. So they take the year 1, and I am using last year's tax rate because everything in this presentation is based on fiscal year 21-22, because those are the numbers that we have right now. We don't have solid numbers for 22-23 yet. So everything is based on 21-22 in this presentation. So that is why the tax cap percentage here is 7.7%. So for the cap taxes, if it's not your primary residence, they take the $28.68.43 times 1.077, which brings us to $3,060.61. Again, they do the test to say taxes as assessed or the cap taxes, which one is lower, because they have to take the lower of the two. So that is how the property tax cap works. And then you can see, obviously, or subtract the difference between taxes as assessed versus the capped taxes, and that is their tax cap abatement or their savings with the tax cap difference. Clark County historical tax caps. So as you can see, for fiscal year 6, when it first started, all the way through fiscal year 11, we were consistently at the 3 and 8%. And as the market started to decline and the way that the Department of Taxation determines the alternative tax cap, it is either 2 times the CPI index or consumer price index, or they take a 10-year rolling average of the assessed values from all of the counties. And so as the values started to take a turn and go downward, then it in turn adjusted the secondary tax cap. So that's how you will see in fiscal years 12, there was no longer 3 and 8. We were at 3% and 6.3%. Then in FY13, 3%, 6.4. And the most shocking one of these is FY17, when everyone paid 0.2%. They were way below the 3%. Everyone paid 0.2% in FY17, almost no change in their taxes. Then FY18, you can see we're coming out of it. So now we're at, everyone again paid 2.6%. No one paid 3% in FY18. FY19, then it was 3%, and then the other was 4.2%. FY20, 3% and 4.8. And as the market and the values continue to grow and get better, obviously the tax cap percentages for the other property type, as you can see, is increasing again.
Ms. Johnson, before you go a little bit further and the rest of this presentation, can you at least put on the record so we can frame questions later? What were the circumstances around FY17 and then FY18? Do you know what triggered?
No, I'm not sure how or what they used. I'm not sure if they used the CPI that year or what formula or how they calculated. That would be a question for the Department of Taxation. I'm not sure if Jeff Mitchell is on the line, and maybe he can answer that question because they are the ones who send us or notify us that this is the tax cap percentage that we use.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead and continue the presentation. Okay.
Madam
Yes?
Chair, Carson
Mr.
City.
Mitchell? Hi, I can't see you, but okay.
We're here. Hi, Madam Chair, Dave Dolly, Carson City Assessor. To answer your question, those years were based on CPI times 2. Because the CPI was 0.1% or 0.01%, multiplied times 2, that would be the 0.2. In most of the counties, we had a negative 10-year rolling average, and so the CPI was going to be the base as far as the cap was concerned.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. And I am going to go to you guys up north. I'm not ignoring you. I just have Ms. Johnson start off. Okay? All right. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson. It was a lot of information, and I had to pinpoint that one. Okay, go ahead.
No worries. Thank you, Madam Chair. And so those are the historical tax caps for Clark. And just to show you how each county can vary, I've provided on the next one some historical tax cap for Story County, which is another county up north. And you can see that theirs obviously stayed 3% and 8% a lot longer than we did down here in Clark. They were a little more consistent until FY16. Even in FY17, they were at 2.9% when we were at 0.2. So this is just something to share that how, even though we're all in the same state, how the historical tax caps vary between counties. And the same for Washoe. Again, from fiscal year 06 through 9, they were consistently 3 and 8, and then things started to fluctuate starting with FY10, and then they too in FY17 were at 0.2%. And then things are starting to pick up for Washoe, and for FY22 they were at 6.3%. So not all counties mirror each other when it comes to the tax cap or the secondary tax cap, just based on perhaps their values or how the Department of Taxation determines it for each county. So I just wanted to provide those slides so that everyone knows that Clark and Washoe and Story and the other counties can vary in their tax caps. We also have economic development abatements. These are administered by the governor's office. It's pursuant to NRS 3610687. And what these abatements allow for is a partial abatement up to 50% of taxes imposed on personal property for a period of 1 to 10 years. And it's for new and expanded businesses which make a significant capital investment based on the population of the county or city where it will be located. So I think all of the counties have some of these economic development abatements on some of their records. There also are energy abatements that are administered by the governor's office. Again, they inform us who qualifies for these abatements, and then we apply them to our records. These energy abatements are pursuant to NRS 701A, and it also allows for a partial abatement of certain property taxes for certain building structures which meet energy efficient standards. However, on July 1 of 2021, the Green Building Tax Abatement Program was discontinued, but there are still 10 years remaining for projects that were approved for the 22-23 fiscal year. So again, this is the governor's office that informs us who has met the eligibility requirements to receive these energy abatements, and then we in turn apply the exemption as they instruct us to our records to give them the abatement. So here is an example of the taxable values for some of the energy and economic development abatements that we have by county. In fiscal year 21-22, Story County had $6.9 billion as an estimate of economic and energy abatements. Washoe had $57 million approximately of energy and economic development abatements, and Clark had about $7.7 billion in taxable value of energy and economic development abatements. Again, not dollars, but actual value that we applied. I'm going to talk a little bit more about new values outside of the tax cap. I think I demonstrated that in the slide where we had the property at year 1 where it did not receive any tax cap abatement because it was new to the tax roll. And That, again, is pursuant to NRS 3614722, 2324, and NAC 3616035. Value that is added outside of the tax or new to the tax roll is going to be taxed as assessed to set the base for the first year. Again, in the example that I talked about in the previous slide. And new value is from new construction, new subdivision parcels, new personal property accounts, and personal property assets that are added to the tax roll for the first time. So there are many different types of new construction, not just new buildings to the tax roll, but perhaps when a new parcel is cut to build those new homes, then they no longer get the tax cap. They're starting brand new because the parcel is new to the tax roll. So to give you an example of what each county, again, just to show the variations and differences between the counties in Nevada, Story County had a taxable value of new construction outside of the tax cap of about $1.58 billion. Washoe County had new construction outside of the tax cap at about $3.3 billion. And Clark County had new taxable value outside of the tax cap at about $13.6 billion. So you can just see the very differences in the amount of new construction being added across the counties. And then this is all new revenue not subject to the tax cap. It is taxes as assessed. And this is just for FY22.
I'm sorry, Ms. Johnson, can you just break that down a little bit further before we move to the next slide? When you say it is not revenue, but it is?
These numbers, these are just values.
This
is just value. It's not in dollars.
Okay, because I'm interpreting this as, it's like anything that's outside of the parcel, well, anything that becomes new, it's almost like a little boost.
Yes, it is revenue added, correct. And it is revenue that is not discounted, so to speak. It is true revenue, that value times the tax rate, those are the taxes.
And then the following year, these new parcels are then subject to an abatement.
That is correct.
Man, we got a lot of work to do. Okay, continue.
Yes. Exemptions. So we have partial exemptions that we add to our records as well for surviving spouse, the blind, veterans, and disabled veterans. Lodges and other charitable organizations are entitled to partial exemptions, which in turn reduces their total taxable value. And then we have full exemptions on parcels or property that is not taxed at all, and those would be state lands, political subdivisions of the state, school districts and charter schools, pollution control, qualifying low-income housing projects, and churches and chapels. Those are all 100% exempt properties. And that concludes the presentation from the Nevada Assessors Association. So if there are any questions, we have people up in Carson, myself, that will do our best to answer any of your questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So up north, I know we have, what is Story County, Humboldt County, and Dave Dolly. Do you have anything to add before we jump into questions from the members?
Thank you, Senator Neal. Dave Dolly, Carson City Assessor. We don't have anything else we wanted to add, but we did want to be here to represent kind of all kinds of different counties, because of the 17, there's not one county that's going to be the same. So Andy is here from Humboldt County representing the rurals, and then we have Jana, who is from Story County, who has a huge knowledge on the abatements, economic abatements, and we're here for any questions for you.
Thank you. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. So members, questions, I have the chat open, but you can also raise your hand and so I see Assemblywoman Kansama, and then I'll do Considine. And then who? Oh, Assemblyman Hafen has 1 million questions. So we'll curve that down to 3. And so Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair, so much. So my question was, when you were speaking as to the values outside the tax cap, when you gave an example of, let's say a parcel of land is subdivided, they build a new house, and that's full value, at least for the first year. My question would be, if somebody gets permitted an addition to the home, they add a bedroom, they add a casita, is that portion of the house outside the tax cap?
Yes, it is. So 2 years later, a property owner decides to add a pool, they add an additional patio, they do an addition. When we go out to pick that up and add it to our tax rolls, that too is outside of the tax cap. Yes,
For that first year?
for the first year, correct.
Okay, can I have one additional question, Chair?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
This is a very flexible meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just missed on, I know it's in my exhibit, but the partial exemptions, you had surviving spouse, blind, veterans, and there was a fourth one. What was that?
Oh, I think I mentioned there's blind, surviving spouse, veterans, and I may have added disabled veterans. Sometimes we, say veterans and disabled veterans, and then the blind, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, all right. Assemblywoman Considine.
Okay, I do have a couple of questions. One of them is going back to one of the earlier slides on the tax rates. It was 3% of rental residential at or below HUD rates. So my question is, what is the process, or what is somebody who has a rental property that is charging below or at HUD rates? How do they prove that to get that 3% as a rental, as opposed to somebody doing higher than market or not those rates? How do they get that tax rate?
So what happens, and I'm going to speak for Clark, and perhaps the other counties can speak for themselves if they do something different. So what we initially do is, when we send the card out to the property owner, when the property sells, and if they tell us it is a rental, that's the box that they check. They send that back into our office, and then what we do in turn is send them an affidavit. On that affidavit, it shows, is it a studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom? We have boxes for them, and then they tell us, and because it is an affidavit that they are signing and they are stating, I'm going to tell the truth, they tell us what they're renting that 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom for. They write it in for us, sign it and date it, and send it back. And when we get the form back, we review what they wrote, if it falls within the HUD guidelines.
Okay, so it's based on a signed affidavit and what they're telling you they're renting the property for. And that occurs every year?
Every
Or
year,
just
they
upon
have to do
sale?
it every year. I'm sorry?
That was it. I was just wondering if it was, they have to fill out that affidavit every year, or is it just when the house is sold?
No, that process is annually because the HUD rates change annually.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a second question. If you could just walk me through, so I have an understanding of how this works, is, let's say a house is built in 1985. And somebody lives in it all the time. Then it is sold in, let's say, 2019. When the tax calculation is done and the depreciation occurs, if I have this right, every year the land and the improvements are reviewed, and then the depreciation is taken from that total. But when the house is now sold in 2019, does it start at the amount that it was sold for, or does it still work at that land value and improvements value from being, built in 1985?
So it starts for us when they purchase the property, the tax cap stays with the property. So the value may have obviously increased from the time it was built back in the 80s, even though there's depreciation on the property, but that doesn't mean that the land can't increase. So over time, the assessed value or the taxable value may have increased. However, the tax cap stays with the property. So in 1988, the value of that home could have been $90,000. But as we fast forward to today's market, the taxable value of that property is probably $130,000. However, the taxes are still capped based on going all the way forward.
I'm sorry, based on when you say going all the way forward.
From the time the property started or from the time the tax cap, those taxes just stay with the property based on the tax cap. We do not say now that you purchased, we're going to now give you a whole new tax bill at the assessed amount. The property tax cap that has followed that property all the way through, when the new owner purchases it, those are their taxes.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense, Assemblywoman?
Yes.
Okay.
Madam
Thank
Chairman,
you.
may I make a comment real quick? It's
Yes,
Dave.
please.
It's Dave from Carson City. Just wanted to clarify real quick that the depreciation is only on the structures. It's not on the land. Land is not depreciable. And so just for clarification purposes, and yes, as Brianna was saying, we do not rebase any of the abatements or depreciation upon a sale of the property. What the taxes are what they're going to be for the new purchaser.
Assemblywoman Considine, do you have a follow-up to that? Or are you good?
I have like a lot, but I will wait to see if others ask that and then come back when I have them better formed if we have time or after this. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any assessors up north that would like to add before I go to the next set of questions? Okay. So Assemblyman Hafen, and then after that, Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms. Johnson, thank you very much for the presentation today. I deal with property taxes on a fairly regular basis. I'm fully aware of most of this, but you've got my mind moving in a million different directions, and I apologize. But I've been told I'm only allowed 3 questions by the chair, so I'll try to keep it simple. The tax abatements, looking at your charts from 2017 and 18, never hit the 3%. I'm going to just stick with the residential primary residence at the 3%, but was actually at 0.2 the one year and 2.6 the next year, even though the home values were increasing at 7 to 8% during that time frame. And I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what the next year is. I know inflation's out of control this year, so we're probably not looking at something like that. But could you just kind of touch a little bit on the history of that, how that 2 times the CPI came about in relationship to the 3%? Just so I have a little bit better understanding of why we went so low when the values of the homes were increasing at substantially more than that.
Okay, Dave, I didn't know if you wanted to answer that, but I do
I'd be
have
happy
the
to.
statute here, or?
I'd be happy
Okay,
to.
thank you.
Assemblyman Hafen, so Nevada law, what it says is that when each year to determine what the alternative cap is, so that would be the 8% cap, the Department of Taxation has to look at what the rolling average, the 10-year rolling average is for each county. They then compare that to CPI times 2. Whichever number is actually higher is the number that they then compare to the 8%. And then whichever of those two numbers is lower is the number that they actually use. So in 2017 for Carson City, we had a negative 10-year rolling average, so that we then looked at the CPI times 2. CPI times 2 was 0.2%. They compared that to the 8%, but that was less than what the 8% is, so they had to go with the 0.2%. Because they had to do that for the commercial industrial vacant property, for the alternative capped properties, they also had to do that for the single family owner occupied properties. So at that point, every single property in Carson City went up to 0.2%. You can't have the residential going up higher than the commercial because that's statutorily not available. So it was all based on what the current 10-year rolling average was and CPI times 2 at that point.
Madam Chair, this is your again. If I may just add to Mr. Dahley's statement, that I want to make clear, and it's not that it's been misstated, but to make clear that it's the 10-year moving average in the growth in assessed value for the county as a whole. Because there's been some reporting and discussion that might lead a reader to believe that it's based on the 10-year moving average of the assessed value of the property. It is the 10-year moving average of the assessed value for the county. And then, as Mr. Dahley stated, then the number that comes out of that 10-year moving average growth rate calculation is compared to 2 times the CPI. And then 0 is the floor and 8% is the ceiling. And so then it can float between there depending upon the 2 times CPI and the 10-year moving average. But I appreciate you allowing me to make that clarification, that just for the members, that it's not the individual property's average assessed value growth rate. It's the county's assessed value growth rate that is being used to determine this alternative abatement cap factor.
Thank you for that in-depth explanation. And Madam Chair, if you'll indulge me, I'll go to my second question. I am going to limit it to 3. I want to touch on the renewable energy facility abatements. I know we kind of touched on that, but if I understood it, the governor's, I think it was the GOED office, determines what those are going to be. Do we know what those are, maybe last year, for those renewable energy facilities? And then my other question on that subject is that are we currently offering tax abatements to these renewable energy fields that are providing energy outside of the state of Nevada?
Jana, did you want to chime in on those? Or Dave?
Good afternoon. Jana Seddon, Story County Assessor. For the renewable energy, I apologize. We do not have that broken down as to part of the abatement totals that we have. We just kind of, we're trying to get everything together for this presentation. So I believe all of us pulled them as a whole, so we don't have those separated out this time. And right now, I know I have a couple of renewable energy abatements, and they're at 50%. So that applies to real property and personal property, whereas a lot of your GOED abatements only apply to your personal property, but your renewable energy definitely applies to real property and personal property. And I apologize, I've already forgotten what your last question was.
The second half of that question was whether or not those abatements or those facilities that were getting the, it looks like 50% abatement, are providing energy solely to the state of Nevada, or if they are exporting energy to other states.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure if we're even privy to that information at this point.
That would more than likely be through the governor's office of energy.
Thank you. And then, Madam Chair, I think I hit my 3 questions, so I will I'll let others go.
All right, so then we will move back to the Zoom. I'll take Assemblywoman Cohen because I think I missed you, and then I'll do Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. So this year seems like it was the first time I ever saw the public getting very active in the 3% cap and whether or not the 3% cap was on their house. I don't remember social media discussing it so much, and people discussing it so much in the last several years. So could you, and there was a lot of misinformation out there, can you just let us know what people have to do to ensure the cap is on their primary residence? And then if there's anything we can do to help get that information out to our constituents. Oh, and if it has to be renewed, like if they have to do whatever they have to do, if they have to do it every year, or if they send in their postcard once, if that's good enough.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Cohen. So again, I'm going to speak for Clark. I can't speak for the other counties. And so the way property owners are notified, the way they know about their property tax cap, every year, the assessor's office, we make a social media post. This year, I believe it was April 22nd. We posted to social media that we were preparing to mail out property tax cap cards to new homeowners, and that existing homeowners could also check their tax cap, and we gave them the website. So that is an annual thing that we do. We post it to Clark County Facebook page, Twitter. We put it out there. Again, this year it was in April. And on top of that, when we mail out the tax bills that everyone gets annually from the treasurer's office, they will notice on their tax statement, it states, if this is your primary residence and your property tax cap percentage is not at 3%, please contact the assessor's office, and it gives our information. So again, we posted early in the year on Facebook, Twitter, informing everyone that we are about to mail out cards and informing existing property owners that they can check their tax cap percentage at that time. In July, every July, when they get their tax bill, on their tax bill, again, it states, if this is your primary residence and your tax cap percentage is not 3%, to contact the assessor's office. So I think, and I don't know where the misinformation came from, but what I think happened was it was saying that you would permanently be set. So there were words used to perhaps urge people in a sense of urgency to come forward, almost as if you're not going to be able to change this if you don't do it now, which is not a true statement. So I believe that is what the frenzy was when it came to that message that was sent out, that people probably thought they were going to be stuck, or that people saw the 8% and then they were saying 8% of your assessed value, not your actual taxes. So it was just a lot of misinformation that people didn't understand. And then to put a deadline on there that wasn't truly the deadline made it even worse in such a short amount of time. So you are right, Assemblywoman Cohen, in that, as you can see in this presentation, as I mentioned, the tax cap has been in place since FY6, 2005, 2006, and it has always been notified. Even when it initially started, we would send the tax cap cards out again here in Clark on an annual basis. But then it got to the point where we know that the treasurer is going to send those every year. So there was no reason for the assessor and the treasurer to duplicate efforts in sending out the same two notices about the tax cap, when ultimately the tax cap lies with the treasurer. The assessor's office is just the administrator to say, tell us what it is, and then we in turn give it to the treasurer's office, and they calculate taxes on the tax cap. So the tax cap truly lies on taxes and the treasurer. And so that's why we saw it best fit coming from their office, because that's where it is displayed when they get their tax bill.
Madam Chair, can I give a different county's perspective on that?
Yes.
Thank you. Dave Dolly, Carson City Assessor. So in 2005, 2006, we sent out a card to every single property owner. We only have a little over 20,000 parcels here in Carson City. So 2005, we sent out an owner occupancy verification card is what we called it, to verify whether it's owner's primary residence or a rental property. We did that in 2005 and again in 2006. After that, the process for us was if they've reported it as it being owner occupied for the last 2 years, then we did not send out another owner verification card for them. If they changed their address or their mailing address, or if they changed, sold the property, then at that point we would send the owner verification card to figure out what was going on with the property. But we only did that if the address or name changed. Each year, the assessor's office is required to send out assessment notices in November or December. We send ours out in November. And on the assessment notices itself, it will tell you whether or not it's receiving the 3% cap or it's a rental property. And we get a lot of questions on that. And trust me, last week, when Clark County had that misinformation, we got bombarded with calls up here. A lot of actually calls from Clark County calling us to say, what is our property? I'm like, I don't know, call them. So that's the process that we use, and it's worked very well for us, and we've been very pleased with how it's worked for us.
And then also, I do want to add, thank you, Dave, for that, because we do the same thing. Once you have said that it is your primary residence and you are receiving the 3% tax cap, the only time that can change or it prompts us to send you a new card to let us know is if the ownership changes or something changes on the property, then we also send out a new card. But if you have it at the 3% and nothing changes on the property, then the 3% tax cap stays with the property. And Dave is correct in that he mentioned they have over 20,000 parcels, and we have over 800,000 parcels here in Clark County. And with that, I want to add, because we have so many sales and transactions that are happening, we do send out our notice of value cards in December as well. However, we didn't think it was a good idea to put the tax cap information on our cards because sometimes people have purchased their property after the lien date, and we don't want them to think they're getting 3% when it shows up on their notice of value card, because that is subject to change, because they're going to get a notice letting them know that they need to tell us what their property tax cap is, so that we don't misinform on that notice of value card and they see 3% and they think they're okay. It's possible that abatement can fall off because they just recently purchased the property. So that's why we relied heavily on the treasurer's office, because at that moment in time, that is what their tax cap percentage is. Thank you.
Okay, Assemblywoman Cohen, that's it? Okay. So then I will move to Assemblywoman Anderson, and then next is Senator Gansard, and then Senator Dennis. That's who I was missing, right? Okay. Assemblywoman Anderson?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. This is way outside my wheelhouse, so you're going to have to walk me through a few things. And I promise, though, I'll only do 3 questions as well. My first question has to do with the slide that has... I believe it was slide 7. You had mentioned that there are 120 different tax rates in Clark County alone. Is that all set from the treasurer's office, or is that set in other areas of NRS code or NAC or even at the county? I'm just wondering where all of those 120 different tax rates are coming from.
Those are set by, again, the Nevada Department of Taxation. They determine what the tax rates are for each of the different entities or cities in our county.
I'm
Chair,
sorry.
this is your staff opinion, and maybe I can comment on that to just provide some additional information. So what we call the combined tax rate, which is the sum of all the individual rates that would be imposed on property depending on the tax district in which the property is located, is a myriad of rates depending on the tax district. Some of those rates are actually fixed and set by statute. such as the 75-cent rate for the funding of schools, such as the 17-cent state debt rate. So some of the rates are imposed by statute. Others are imposed by local governments for special districts based on other authority in the law to do so. And then some of the rates are those rates imposed by the local governments, that is counties, cities, towns, again, based on the statutory authority for them to set rates. And so they would have the authority under law to set their rate. And that rate could be for operating purposes and or for debt purposes. And then it's correct that then all that information has to come to taxation so that they can look at all those rates and make sure that they don't violate the maximum $3.66 rate that can be imposed on property in the state of Nevada. And so hopefully that provides a little bit more information to the Assemblywoman's question on what that combined rate is and what it can be composed of.
Huge clarification. And I know that some people up here in the north were also like, maybe there's something else. So I didn't know if you guys wanted to add anything either. Thank you so much, because Mr. Ginden, I know that you have all 120 of these memorized, so we'll be talking with you later to have you kind of go through that Jeopardy game with us to try to figure out what they all are. My second question actually has to do with the next, with the cap itself on property tax. And I believe I already know this answer, but it is something that's definitely impacting our local governments in particular. That has to do with the cap is present based upon NRS. Is there a floor present as well, or only a cap?
So I will take that question, I guess. No, there isn't a floor at this time. So based on the historical tax caps, as you can see in the presentation, I think that's how we got to the 0.2%, because there was not a floor. Nothing's saying that it can't go below the 3%. So that's how we got to the 0.2%. There is a max of 8%, but there is no floor at this time.
Madam Chair, Russell and your staff, if I can just add to Ms. Johnson's information, that technically there is a floor. The floor is 0%, and that comes through the calculation of what we've been referring to as the alternative partial abatement cap, which can range between 0 and 8%. So the floor is 0. And so what happened in that FY17, inflation was 0.1, and so then times that is the 0.2. Well, then under the law, if the alternative partial abatement offers a partial abatement cap factor that's lower than the 3% that could be for single family owner occupied homes or qualified rental homes, then they get that lower cap factor that comes out. That's why you saw both of them drop down to the same value. And so thus, if you would have a situation where the floor, where the alternative partial abatement cap factor would end up being 0. And for example, when could that occur? It would be unlikely, but if you had a deflationary period, and who knows, after all this inflation we're seeing, I don't think you'll see deflation, you'll see a slowing inflation. But if you had negative, the CPI went down and did not grow, that could result in a negative. So then 0 trumps the negative. As Mr. Golly's already pointed out, you can have a negative 10-year average growth in assessed value. Then the 0 trumps that. So the 0 sits there as a floor for the alternative partial abatement cap factor calculations. And so if it would become 0, then single family owner occupied homes would also get that 0, as well as qualified rental. So I just wanted to offer that as I look at it, there technically is a floor for the partial abatements, and that floor is 0, but it's coming through the way the calculation mechanism for the alternative partial abatement caps. And if I misstated that for any of the other assessors, please jump in, but that's how I look at the law and look at how the alternative partial abatement cap factors work.
Thank you for that.
Wow. And thank you, Chair. This will be my last question. I'm looking at slide 17, or either 17 or maybe it's 19, the new value outside the tax cap by county. Can you explain that to me a little bit more? Does this mean that this is help possibly for our counties, or is this, these numbers are pretty large, and I'm trying to understand how they can help us and the investment that we have in our counties and in our state, or what exactly these numbers really translate to. When it says the taxable value for Story, for example, is 1.5 billion and Washoe is 3.3 and Clark is 13.5. What does that really mean? And again, I'm showing my lack of understanding always with this. I just need a little bit more clarification about what this really means to help us continue to invest in our state and our counties.
I didn't know if anyone from Carson was going to go, or I can go. So what this is new revenue that is not subject to the tax cap. So all existing value or revenue is capped in some manner, meaning 3% or up to 8%. But this is truly brand new revenue added to the tax roll outside of the tax cap, if that makes sense.
Brianna,
everything, yeah.
if I could just, I kind of just give you a hypothetical. So in Carson City, our tax rate is $3.57 per $100 of assessed valuation. So if you multiply that $1,585,000,000 times 35%, and then multiply that times the tax rate, that's about $1,900,000 of revenue that was not in existence. It's not based on the property tax. That's all new. That's going to be going to the schools, the state, the counties, all those. But that's just what's outside the cap the first year. So that would have been almost $2 million.
Thank you for the clarifications from both of you, and thank you, Chair, for that much leniency in my questions.
Assemblywoman Anderson, this is Jana Seddon. I do want to also say, like for Story County, this is all new revenue outside the tax cap. But for Story County, the vast large majority of our new revenue comes from our industrial park. So unfortunately, a lot of this gets abated. These are our taxable values. The abatement gets applied during the treasurer's side of things. So we have this value, but for us, a vast large majority of this will be subject to an abatement, a go-at abatement.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Members, I'm actually loving this hearing, but I'm special. So I will go to Senator Gansert and then to Senator Dennis, and I believe Assemblywoman Consama, you had another question? Okay. All right. So Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Chair Neal. So I was following up on Assemblyman Haven's question when he asked about the energy facilities and whether that production had to stay within the state. And I was looking at 701A, and I can't find it, but my question is really to legal to make sure they get back to us on that. So if we're going to give an abatement for a facility that's producing renewable energy, and there's a list of what qualifies, whether or not that abatement, they only qualify if all the energy they produce stays within our state.
Thank you. I don't think anybody wants to comment
Madam
on
Chair.
that one. Okay, go ahead.
Carson Andy Heiser, Humboldt County Assessor. My only comment to that, and this is just an assumption that all those solar plants would have to tie into the grid, and I assume that they don't want to tie in at a far distance, so most of that is going to be bought by NV Energy, just an assumption. and then it would be sold from them to potentially out of state.
So energy, I used to work for power companies. So energy does connect to the transmission system and then it gets wheeled different places, but they can actually, you can differentiate the production. And that's why you have different fees or individuals or companies that can buy like renewable energy. If they choose to buy that and pay potentially more or less, I mean, they can have contracts. So I just think it's important that we look at statute. And I scanned through it and could not find any requirements that the renewable energy has to stay within the state. So I just wanted legal to follow up with us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Senator Gansert. All right, so Senator Dennis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been trying to write off the ones I had multiple questions, but most of these have been at least addressed. I do have one clarification on the discussion that was had earlier on the deadline and all of this information and all of that. Is there a deadline where they have to fill to be able to get the cap? Is there a deadline they have to do that, or can they do it any time and then it's either retroactive or it comes on for the next year?
Thank you for the question. So yes, there is a deadline. There is a deadline every fiscal year, and that deadline is June 30th. So for the upcoming fiscal year, which is July 1 of 22 through June 30th of 23, any property owner has the ability to fix their tax cap up until June 30th of the following fiscal year, And then next year, that deadline changes again. So it depends on the fiscal year that you're in. June 30th is always the deadline within that fiscal year.
Can they file that any time?
Anytime. So if they get their tax bill and they decide to call us in December and say that their tax rate or tax cap percentage is incorrect for the 22-23 fiscal year, they can notify our office and we will correct it. The treasurer's office will then be notified and they will receive a revised bill adjusting any remaining quarters that they haven't paid on their taxes.
Senator Dennis, this is Dave from Carson City. Just for clarification points. So yes, the deadline is June 30th, and we have until the next June 30th for them to notify us of the correct tax cap. But it's only going to affect that 1 year. So if they reported an incorrect tax cap 3 years ago, then that tax cap would still be the same. We can only correct the current year that we're currently in for the tax cap.
So just so I'm clear, are you saying that if they report it, like if they reported it now, for example, if somebody reported it today, does that go backwards retroactively?
Correct. So what happens if somebody was to send in a card today and we had taxed it at the higher cap, we would notify the treasurer's office that the tax cap would change. The treasurer's office would send them out a new adjusted bill to reflect a 3% tax cap for the current year.
Okay, great. Thank you. Also, just a comment. I realize that they get it on the sheet on the card that you get, at least with Clark County. I don't know about the other one. But you mentioned that it was like social media and other things, and I know a lot of my constituents, that's not a thing for them. So anytime you send out notices on Facebook or any other social media, not very reliable for folks, at least in my district. But just a comment. And then the other question I had is if they have the rental property and if they reside in the rental property, let's say they own a triplex or a duplex or fourplex. If they reside there, is it different than if it was just their residence?
This is Dave from Carson City. Yes, it does actually. So our system is actually set up to where the portion that is actually owner occupied would get the 3%, and then we would send out the questionnaire for the second unit if it's hypothetically it's a duplex, and if the second unit was not under the fair market rents and it was actually capped at the higher cap, there would be a bifurcated property tax cap interpolated bifurcated, whichever word you prefer. But yes, there is a way to do it so that a portion of it is actually getting the owner's primary residence cap.
Is that consistent throughout all the counties that way?
I know it
Yes, that
is
is correct for us as well.
through the DevNet count or the different software programs. So there's 7 of us that have one particular software, and I know that's the way it is for us.
Great. I think that answers all my questions. The rest of them were already asked earlier, so thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. So we have Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Johnson, for this great presentation and for bearing with us on all our questions. I had 2, I guess, comments. One was with the recent confusion with people on their tax abatements, and I know you put it out in your social media, maybe emphasizing that where they can find out is the treasurer's office versus the assessor's office, because I think everybody goes to the assessor's office versus the treasurer's. And like I said, I know you've done that, but I think emphasizing that because it's right there on the treasurer's for the parcel with under the property characteristics, because I just pulled one up and I see it's a residential and subject to the 8%. So that would probably help people maybe find those a little bit quicker. And then I just wanted to make a comment on the abatements that the governor's office provides, because we just keep hearing the word abatements, but when the governor's office gives the abatement, it is based on the full value that people are bringing into the county, for example, with Story, because it isn't just that one commercial building or industrial site. It's the reason an abatement is granted to these entities is because of all the additional economic benefits they're bringing into the area with additional housing, other units, and those are taxed at the property tax rates, and they bring in sales tax. And so I know the governor's office does a complete overview of the full economic value coming in before they consider granting an abatement. So I just didn't want to leave it with we're losing revenues when really the point of the abatement is we're getting more revenues in other areas. Thank you, Chair.
Does anybody want to, that was more of a comment. I don't know if anybody has a response to that or just leave that alone. Okay. I didn't know if you're reaching for the mics for Story. Do you have a comment? No? Okay. You sure? Because that it looked like you were just like, I cannot hold. All right, then. Okay. So I think this has been a super robust conversation. We have a lot to cover. I only had one question, and it was on the presentation around, it was NRS 361 0687, when you talked about the period of 10 years for the abatement. But you know, also in the law, it allows, you said, I think it was that that it pretty much goes for 10 years. It was a slide. I think it was at the beginning. But it's my understanding that also in the abatement or the economic development statute, they're also allowed to do an extension without having to come back, which could turn that into 20 years. So how do you guys deal with I'm assuming you get notice that, okay, now they've tacked on another 10 years. But talk about how that broader works when you get that notice and then you now know this 10 is going to be 20.
Madam Chair.
So in Clark,
Brianna, do you want to go ahead?
You can go ahead up north.
Okay. Madam Chair, this is Jana Seddon from Story County. Basically how that works is that extension doesn't apply to the same assets that it applied to in their original. Basically, the extension that they get says that they are doing an expansion to their site, and so it's kind of like a whole new abatement on additional equipment. So that's kind of how that works. At least that's how we do it in Story, and I think something sent out and we kind of found out that all the counties are definitely doing things the same way as far as that goes. Did I answer?
Okay, so that's really good information. Thank you for that. All right, okay, go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
And I apologize, Madam Chair. I do want to make one clarification. When I talked about the different tax rates that we have, my wording of the term I should have used are tax districts that we have. Approximately 120 tax districts, not rates. So I just wanted to clear that up. The number of districts we have in Clark.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so we will move on. I appreciate this presentation, so we'll move on to the Department of Tax. But what I will say to the Department of Tax, because we've had a lot and it's been super robust, if there's anything that we've already discussed, you can just go ahead and move those things out of your slide, and then we'll just discuss anything that's new in your presentation, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will do my best so, as we do have a little bit of repetition.
Okay, thank you.
Give me 1 second to bring that forward. Hopefully that is showing for everybody. Again, it is a pleasure to meet with you, Madam Chair, and members of committee. My name is Jeff Mitchell. I am the Deputy Director of Local Government Services at the Nevada Department of Taxation. I'm going to spend the majority of my time and presentation on the interaction and interplay between the Nevada Department of Taxation and local governments in regards to the property tax system. I'll focus a little bit on some of the things that the assessors, without duplication, speaking to different limitations that are placed on exemptions, abatements, and revenue limits, and so forth. The first slide that I'd like to bring forward is just an attempt to show the interaction between the county assessors and the different boards and commissions and how they all play. These are all kind of the key players within the property tax system. The Nevada Tax Commission is the head of the Department of Taxation. It consists of 8 citizens appointed by the governor, and in addition, the governor is an ex officio non-voting member of the Tax Commission. Each commissioner will serve an initial 4-year term and can serve more than 1 term. The commission is designed to be a group of business people with various professional backgrounds who will supervise the overall administration and operations of the Department of Taxation. The Tax Commission meets about 8 to 10 times a year to hear appeals, review and uphold public hearings on regulations, and pursue other such actions as are necessary for the operation of the Department of Taxation. Within the department, and I'll skip this slide as it's kind of repetitive of the different statutes and chapters that govern property tax. Within the department, there is the Division of Local Government Services. We deal with a variety of different things, but focusing on property tax, these are the different areas of the property tax that our section deals with. We do value property. The valuation that we provide, we value what is often referred to as centrally assessed property. And this is property of an interstate or intercounty in nature. If you can think of railroads, airline companies, power companies, gas companies, things that cross county lines, things that cross state lines, those valuations are developed by the Department of Taxation. We also value the net proceeds of minerals, which is determined by establishing the gross value of mineral or ore as sold, less the expenses of mining that are outlined by statute. LGS also has the responsibility for valuing all mining property in the state, the real and personal property of that mining property. This really is, when we value this property, it is a mirror of what the county assessors do. We should be valuing it much like the county assessors would if it was locally assessed property. We then transmit those values to the counties and they bill and collect for the mines there. In regards to oversight of the process, annually we complete what is referred to as a ratio study. This is where staff from the Department of Taxation goes out to the different assessors' offices and we audit a sample of properties and see if the valuation is being done according to statute and regulation. We provide guidance to the assessors as possible. We also reconcile the real property transfer tax, which is a tax upon sale of the property. And we review all local government budgets. Our audit function, we do performance audits on local governments, the assessors and the recorders and the treasurers to make sure policies and standards are consistent among the counties. And we also audit the net proceeds of minerals. Publications that are important to the property tax system. There is about 20 that are developed annually by the department, and these are all available out on the website. We're going to spend about a half an hour, 45 minutes on each one. Just kidding. They're available if you would like more information on them. We will touch on a couple of them as we go through the presentation here. That was my sad attempt at humor. Assessors reports to the Department of Taxation. The relationship between locally our division and the assessors is requisite for a good functioning property tax system. The county assessors have many reports that they are required to file with us, as well as other agencies, and many of these reports are required at different times during the year. On this note, I would just like to express and thank publicly the assessors, the professionalism and expertise that they have, and the responsiveness on these reports are critical to the information that we provide to the public. I'll begin with the Nevada Constitution. Uniform and equal rate of assessment and taxation, valuation of property, exceptions and exemptions are all under Section 1. The legislature shall provide by law for a uniform and equal rate of assessment and shall prescribe such regulations as shall secure a just valuation for taxation of all property, real, personal, and possessory. This establishes what all is taxed within Nevada. It is further backed up by a statutory. Well, here's the Constitution again. So this is establishing the tax rate. The total tax levy for all public purposes shall not exceed 5 cents on $1. As mentioned in the assessor's presentation, the current cap is $3.66, and that is a statutory cap, and I will go over that statute in just a minute. So there's a couple exceptions to the rule, but NRS 361.453 sets the cap at $3.64 on each $100 of assessed valuation. A couple of exceptions is there was an assembly bill passed quite a few years ago that 2 cents is outside of that $3.64, and it is dedicated to various state purposes. We often refer that to as the state debt rate. The exceptions mentioned in NRS 354.705, those deal with local government entities that may fall into severe financial emergency. If they do so, then they can exceed that cap and they can follow those different limitations that are presented there. There is another limitation established by NRS 354.59811. As mentioned in the assessor's presentation, the different taxing rates come to the Department of Taxation to make sure that they qualify per statute before they are approved. One of the limitations that is there is the assessed valuation of all property which was on the preceding fiscal year assessment roll cannot produce 106 of the maximum revenue allowable from taxes ad valorem from the preceding year. So one of the limitations local governments may face when they're trying to establish their rate is this revenue limitation. And we work with the different entities to make sure that whatever rate that is asked for and is established, one, doesn't exceed the statutory rate established of that 364 plus 2%, as well as this 106 revenue generation. Different limitations on value. As mentioned by the assessors, all property is subject to taxation, but all property must be valued or assessed at 35% of its taxable value. So they establish a taxable value, and the assessed value is 35% of that value. How they establish value is according to 361.227, as mentioned, full cash value of land, plus the replacement cost new of improvements, less the statutory defined depreciation. And I'm cruising through the slides here because some of this is repetitive. So if there's any questions or you wish for me to stop or pause, please interrupt. Exemptions. As mentioned in the Constitution, as well as in statute, all property is taxable, except, and there are exceptions to the rule, and those are often referred to as exemptions and abatements. Full exemptions, these are just a highlight of a couple that are out there. And what this means is when a value is established, no tax rate is applied to that value. So state lands, business inventories and consumables, household goods and furniture, irrigation systems, property used for pollution control, qualifying low-income housing projects, churches and chapels. There is quite an extensive list of different exemptions that are out there. One of the publications mentioned before, the property tax elements and applications, which is on the department's website, has a full list of all exemptions as well as abatements that different properties can qualify throughout the state. Partial exemptions, as mentioned before, these don't apply to the full value of the property, but to a certain value amount. And property of surviving spouses, blind persons, veterans, and so forth. There's two places that are easily found on the department's website that list all these exemptions. One is the elements and applications, but also produced every 2 years is the tax expenditure report. The last one that was reported and on the website was for the 1920 year. And this has a list of all the exemptions as well as abatements and the best estimation that we can provide as to the actual dollar amount associated with those exemptions and abatements. There is an important difference between exemption and abatement, and I would like to highlight this. The assessor is to establish value on all property. An exemption is a function of that value. Value is therefore exempted. When we refer to an abatement comes later in the formula. It's an abatement of the taxes, but does not affect the valuation of the property. Has been talked about fairly heavily, and I will point out a couple of different things. The tax cap, as it's often referred to. Historically, before the tax cap, the property tax formula was fairly simple. It was assessed valuation times the rate equals the property taxes due. Now the assessor needs to identify a bunch of different aspects of that property, as mentioned, whether it's a rental property and meeting the HUD qualifications, or if it is new property, or if it's annexed property within a different district, or a variety of different functions, and all those functions apply to the tax cap in a slightly different way. For the fiscal year 2022-23, this is the tax cap that we provide to the different departments. Over on the left-hand column, you can see the moving average growth rate for the current year. And this is a 10-year moving average, so it considers the current year plus the 9 previous fiscal years change over change percentage-wise of the assessed valuation. And so, for example, if you look at Carson City, their moving average growth rate for the 22-23 was right at 5.7%. Has been mentioned, the CPI is quite high. It was at 4.7% year over year change. So twice the CPI is 9.4%. We take the greater of those two numbers, and then we compare it to the resident or to the general cap, that 8%. And we then take the lesser of the greater of the previous two versus the general to establish the tax cap. Because twice the CPI was 9.4, even if you look at Lander County, who had a negative moving average growth rate, because the CPI was at 9.4, their general cap for all property is going to be established at 8% for this year. Recapture is a function of the property tax abatement. It includes a situation where there is a surprise or a drastic drop in valuation from one year to the next, and then that value recovers in value. If a property declines in value 15% or more from its taxable value in the second year and then recovers that in the third year, there are provisions within statute and regulation that allows the recapture of that, so it's not all abated at that lower $60,000 going forward into perpetuity. This is repetitive, so I'll kind of skip forward and go straight to questions if that is okay with you, Madam Chair.
Yes. And I appreciate you skipping so that we don't have double information. If members, do you have any questions to Department of Taxation? They had some, there is some new information in there. Is anyone, show of hands, or Assemblywoman Considine?
I have two questions. One of them, when I was looking over the slides for the full exemptions, I think I kind of got stopped where it says, okay, property of political subdivisions, property of school districts, and charter schools. So the political subdivisions, the school districts, that makes sense because that's typically government property to begin with. But as far as charter schools are concerned, does that mean wherever the charter school is located, the owners are exempt from property tax? So for example, if it's like a real estate firm based out of New York, Florida, somewhere else, and they own like an office building, but there's a charter school within that office building, does that fund out of California, New York, wherever, they don't pay any property taxes because it's a charter school?
So that property that has that charter school, if it qualifies for the exemption, yes, it is exempt from property taxes.
Thank you. And then my second question is, I understand that real property transfer tax, there's a lot of discussion around that not necessarily this is the right forum to discuss it or the right entity to discuss it. But I noticed that it did say that there are reports that the Department of Taxation gets annual reports on those. Are those publicly available?
Yes, they're available on our website. So if you go to our website under the Publications tab, there is a Local Government Service tab, and we provide a quarterly report on the reconciliation of the real property transfer tax, as well as a yearly update of the tax.
Thank you. And then is it correct that the people to learn more about that is probably going to be like the local, not necessarily state, my local jurisdictional folks?
It depends on what the questions are in regards to the real property transfer tax. Some of those would be appropriate for the state, but quite a few would be appropriate for the county recorders.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Because I can't see any hands. Okay, it looks like everyone's good.
Actually, I do have a question.
Okay. Assemblywoman Anderson?
Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead.
It's more of a follow-up from what was just answered. You mentioned with the property of school districts and charter schools, if applicable, what does that mean? Does that mean that a certain percentage of the building is being utilized as a school, or is it the number of hours? I'm wondering if there's a way to possibly dig deeper into what that meant, and then also how, kind of similar to what was in the last presentation, how do you verify that? Is that, again, just an affidavit, or is there a research a little bit more like a school visit or something along those lines? If you could dig a little bit deeper into that information about how the charter schools qualify for that exemption, if there's a way to get that information.
Yeah, yes, so the statute that actually follows is NRS, Jeff Mitchell for the record, my apologies, 361.065, and it states all lots, buildings, and other school property owned by any legally created school district or a charter school within the state and devoted to public school purposes are exempt from taxation. And so when I mentioned as qualified, they would need to be devoted to the public school purposes. And it really depends on how certain charter schools are established, whether or not they would meet that baseline.
Madam Chair, Dave Dolly.
Go ahead.
If I may just add a little bit to that. So there's a number of exemptions that we actually verify on a yearly basis, and this is going to be one of them. So we actually send out a notification. So the property owner himself is responsible for applying for the exemption that is there. We are only going to exempt that portion that the charter school is going to be occupying. The rest of the building itself would actually be taxable, but each year we send out a questionnaire asking how much of or what percentage of that building is actually occupied, because the square footage often changes. We do that for those type of buildings. We do that for low-income housing. We get the rent rules every April to determine exactly how many are falling under the low-income requirements. So that's something that the assessors do on a yearly basis to verify all that information.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that clarification. And then I did have another question on slide 9. When you mentioned that the amount is $3.64, but then you also said that there was another additional 2 cents, and I zoned out or I just didn't understand that a little bit. So if you could explain that a little bit more, that it's $3.64 that it cannot exceed, but then there's an additional 2 cents. So if you could explain that or dig into that just a little bit more, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Yes, so of that $3.64, there is actually a 15-cent rate that is devoted to capital projects within the state, sometimes referred to as the state debt rate. Outside of that 364 is a separate 2 cents that is approved every legislative session, and that too is part of the state debt rate. And I might ask Russell Ginden if that satisfies, if you believe I've clarified that enough. I don't mean to, but when I refer to the 366 cap, that 2 cents is a bill that's passed every legislative session.
Thank you, Mr. Mitchell, and poor Mr. Ginden has to put up with me all the time. So thank you for that clarification. I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you for those questions, and thank you for your presentation, Mr. Mitchell. I actually did get your joke. Thanks for trying. So we will go ahead and close out that presentation, and then we will move to the presentation on potential options to generate additional funding from Guy Hobbs, who's the chair of the Commission on School Funding.
Sorry about that. My name is Guy Hobbs, and I do chair the Commission on School Funding. And just by way of a little bit of background on that commission was established by Senate Bill 543 in 2019 that created the Commission on School Funding and defined its tasks and deliverables. The first thing we were charged with was monitoring the implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, and we were also, and that took the first 2 years roughly of work on the part of this commission to do. That was a significant transformation in terms of the way funds are allocated for education within the state of Nevada, which I'm sure you're all aware. And we were also charged with another task, and that was to identify optimal funding for education in the state of Nevada. I'm not sure who worded that in the bill, but when you ask a group of people, many of which come from the education world and some come from other disciplines, to define the word optimal and actually try to apply a value to it, you can imagine the discussion that ensues. It became rather elusive to do that, but we, and I will cover that in part of this presentation for you, we've made every effort to do that. We were also charged with, if optimal funding is identified, we are to provide the state with the identification of funding sources that could achieve optimal funding over a 10-year period. And the 10-year period, I think, is extremely important to bear in mind as we go through this, because I think some of these numbers might be a bit stunning. And I think some of the funding sources that we're also looking at, it is not without a full understanding of what we're talking about that I bring these forward to you. They're rather uncomfortable anytime you talk about taxes and modifying taxes and creating new revenue. I'm certainly rather well versed on how popular those discussions might be from time to time. But to give you a little bit more background on what the Commission is doing, one of the first tasks, as I mentioned, was to identify optimal funding for education. And again, the discussions that ensued were very robust, but there wasn't widespread agreement on what is identified as optimal. So one of the things that we did was, well, let's look at some other metrics and see how we line up against those. And on the chart that you see, this was for a report that we filed a year ago this past April with the state, identifying where Nevada is on a per pupil spending basis. I fully realize that there are a lot of numbers that float around from year to year, but part of our objective here was to nail this down. Okay, thank you. I can see it better now too. And compare that to the national average. And the other metric that we used was a subject matter expert, APA, who's done a lot of education consulting with the state and what their recommended levels of funding are on a per pupil basis. So this chart is intended to show where we currently are and where we would need to go if we were to achieve the national average, and even beyond that, where we would go if we were to achieve the recommended levels of funding. There we go. So that was for a 2020 report that we filed, and we've recently updated that within the past couple of months. You can see the numbers are largely the same in terms of how they compare to each other. All the numbers have gotten a little bit larger, but these are the updated values that we're currently using. So this would be status quo. If we do nothing, this would show what we would project the amount of per pupil funding to be on an annual basis going forward. And the next slide will show where we would need to be in the lighter blue section if we were to achieve the national average. So in other words, that lighter blue section represents the amount of additional funding that would be needed each of those years to reach the national average by the 10th year. So you wouldn't be at the national average until that 10th year. This would be a phased-in approach to reaching that objective. This represents the incremental shortfall. So the light blue area that you saw in the prior chart, this is those amounts quantified each year of the additional revenue that would be needed each of those years to achieve the national average by year 10. And in aggregate, so you add them up as you move left to right, this is what those totals would be. So in other words, to achieve the national average, there would be a need for $2.3 billion in additional funding each year by 2032. significant and staggering amount of money. And if we were to look at the subject matter experts' recommended level of funding, walk through the same sort of thing, obviously that gap is larger because it was a larger amount of per pupil spending. And this is the incremental shortfall, larger than reaching the national average and totaling up to $3.2 billion by the 10th year if you were to achieve the subject matter experts level of funding. So the commission has been looking at a funding need of somewhere between the 2.3 and the 3.2 billion dollars that you see here, and needing to find revenue sources to fill those gaps to achieve either one of those levels. So that essentially sets forth the targets that we're looking at this point, using those values as a proxy for optimal funding. And again, when you speak with a number of the educators, they would be more prone to say that optimal funding probably runs beyond the proxies that we're currently using. So part of the task was then to look at ways that could be funded over a period of 10 years. We've spent quite a number of meetings talking about alternative revenue sources. And one of the first things that you would recognize is that Nevada's education system traditionally has been largely funded through property tax and sales tax. As you all are aware, there's a 75-cent property tax rate that gets devoted to education within each county. The local school support tax portion of the sales tax is dedicated as a local revenue, under the Nevada plan, was a local revenue source within each county. Those are all now put into the state education fund, but we know there are other revenues that also support education other than those. The recently passed mining tax increase, a portion of the room tax and other taxes over the years that have been earmarked for education all now go into the state education fund, but a substantive portion of traditional education funding in the state of Nevada has come from property and sales tax. And as you can see from your prior presentations today, delving into the world of property tax is a very multifaceted and oftentimes a considerable endeavor to fully understand. And we'll touch on a little bit of what we're talking about with respect to that. Now, the numbers I showed you, and I'll back up to a slide here to make sure that I get this right. So this aggregate shortfall to achieve the national average, those numbers do not yet include consideration of the value of the mining tax, which as of next biennium will also go into the state education fund. That's worth, we believe, by the state's estimates, approximately $80 million per year. And so if you were to look at 2032 and consider the 10-year accumulated value of the mining tax would be about $800 million, deducted from the $2.3 billion would still leave a sizable amount to be funded, $1.5 billion over that period of time. So there's still much of that gap to be closed. So the focus of the commission over the last several months, and we have a life that was set forth in statute for this commission that extends us through September of this year. So our work must be completed by September of this year. We're then required to file a report with the state, including the recommendations, including these target amounts that we've identified, as well as different options that the legislature might consider if it were to pursue a 10-year funding plan to reach those target values. And so I suppose, Madam Chair, what you have as a part of this discussion is somewhat of a case study, applying some of the principles you've been talking about for the last couple of hours. And I'll go into some of the things that we're talking about, and I think the overlap of that will come rather clear. On the property tax side of the world, and in my discussions with the members of the commission, and given the fact that I've been working in and around state and local government finance for a very hard to admit roughly 40 years at this point, I've watched a lot of changes occur in the state of Nevada with respect to property tax. I can actually remember the tax shift in 1981. And I was actually testifying on behalf of the county during the hearings involved in that tax shift, which laid a lot of the groundwork that the gentleman from the Department of Taxation was talking about earlier today, with respect to there being, not just caps on property tax bills, but caps on allowed ad valorem revenue, which are basically the tax rates that can be imposed by counties, cities, towns, other local governments throughout the state. The statutory change in the combined tax rate that was referred to earlier in all of this discussion of 364 plus 2 cents, the 366 cap, the 35% of taxable to assessed valuation. There are so many components to what comprises property tax. And from time to time, I know you all have had discussion over the years of different elements of the property tax system and how sensible they may or may not be. For example, depreciation. Nevada is the only state in the nation that uses a depreciation factor against the improvements to real property. I guess on one hand, we can say to ourselves that makes us very special and unique, but the other 49 states have chosen not to do that. When you apply depreciation against replacement value for the improvements, which is what we do, there is very little hope that the resulting taxable valuation will mimic market value in any way, shape, or form. It does not. And we've heard that come up from time to time. Why don't we look at things like rebasing taxable valuation upon sale of a property? All of those things come up. Method of valuation, again, depreciation, the 366 cap, that comes up from time to time too. I don't recall how many, and I'm sure Russ would correct me if I gave you an incorrect number, but a number of your counties are at the 366 cap today and can do nothing by way of adding additional property tax rate because of the 366 constraint. As the gentleman from the Department of Taxation noted, the constitutional cap is $5. And again, I can remember in the early 1980s when it was $5, not $3.64, and now $3.66. So you have all of those different components that each would be worth a review. But changing any of them would be problematic, simply because of the topic that you've heard quite a bit about today, the abatements. If you were to, I hate to use the word fix, but modify the approach to depreciation, for example, like eliminate the accumulation of depreciation, that might bring us more in line with what the rest of the country does in terms of how they assess property. But because of the abatement caps, it would not generate you any additional revenue above what you have today. If you were to change the method of valuation, again, a lot of states have gone to that. There's a lot of economic rationale for doing that. But would that allow you to generate additional revenue with the abatements in place? Actually, it would not. The notion of raising the 366 cap, that is always this very sensitive issue. And oftentimes these days, if someone wants to put forth a ballot initiative, you have to be very clear that it's outside the abatement if you, in fact, want to generate any additional revenue. So it's all become very complex and extremely constraining. And I fully realize, having worked around government tax and finance for all of these years, how sensitive these topics truly are. But abatements are at the top of the food chain on the property tax side. You can get very little revenue movement without doing something to deal with the abatements. And in one sense, the abatements are your friend. We certainly understand that the public has learned in the past few weeks to embrace the topic of abatements because of the information that went out. I'm not sure, I got a number of those calls as well, and most of those calls to me were, can you explain what this even means? You know, and 3 is less than 8, so that must be better. You know, that's sort of the level of understanding that there appeared to be about that. And the fact that 3 doesn't always equal 3, as you saw in the assessor's presentation earlier, because of that secondary cap and tertiary caps that exist, and you have to take the lower of this or the higher of that, it oftentimes can be below the 3 and 8%. So it's become a very cumbersome and complex system that does constrain your revenue, and that's where it departs from being your friend in terms of tax rate maintenance for the taxpayer, which is hugely important. We all agree on that. And it becomes your enemy on the other side because it constrains your ability to generate additional revenue over time. Now, one thing that hasn't been said that I also remember from the year that the abatements were brought to the legislature, that wasn't the only way to control property taxes for individuals. The setting of the tax rate was the other way to control it. And, you know, we can't suppose at this point in time what the counties and the local governments would have done to adjust their rates while the assessed valuations were spiking upward. But I can certainly tell you, having spent 15 years as a chief financial officer for Clark County many years ago, we would have adjusted those rates downward to compensate for the increase in assessed valuation. We also would have adjusted rates downward due to the maturity of debt. There are a couple of reasons why that would have happened. So the abatements weren't the only way to attack that particular problem. But the fact remains that the abatements act as a constraint against the ability to raise future revenue. It's interesting too, I was looking at the presentation today and thinking about the 3% that was set for residential. And I remember the arguments because the initial proposal was for a higher value than the 3%. And the compromise arrived at 3%, and there must have been some at least implied presumption that 3%, again, just focusing on the residential, not the blended residential, non-residential side, that 3% growth in property tax revenue on the residential side would be enough to compensate for all of the growth in costs of services over time. And we know in times like this where price indexes, including the CPI, are running 2.5 times that may in fact not always be the case. And it certainly isn't at this particular time. And if you go back to, I think it was 2017-18 fiscal year when it was 0.2% that was allowed in growth, I can guarantee you that the cost of providing services for education for local governments wasn't 0.2% growth in cost. That just simply doesn't work that way. So one of the things that we're looking at, just to be very transparent with you all, is the abatements. What can be done to deal with the abatements over a 10-year period to allow for some additional revenue growth without losing the, I guess, the friend side of the abatements, the good side of the abatements? Is that a capping mechanism on accrued abatements? It's interesting to note, for example, when you consider the amount of money we were talking about for education, that the current level of accrued abatement pardon me, statewide is well in excess of $1 billion, just the accrued abatement. So that would be the taxable value side of the world pre-abatement. If the abatements weren't applied, there could theoretically be that much additional tax revenue. Now that's accumulated over a period of time, so that's certainly not an annualized number. And that isn't to say that that's a panacea for funding problems, but it is an indicator to me that some revenue capacity probably does lie in a reevaluation of the abatements and how those accrue over time, whether that's capping or phasing or actually one of the things that we're going to be looking at is there a way to actually reduce combined property tax rates, absorb a portion of that abatement to allow some additional cap room under the 366 cap. We believe mathematically that that will work. We also recognize that there may be some challenges given that it could have differential impacts on different types of properties, but that's being evaluated at this point by the commission. So again, to be transparent, that's something we're looking at. I mean, obviously, as I stated earlier, there are a number of other facets of the property tax system, like the depreciation, the combined rates, method of valuation, the use of the 35% against the taxable value to arrive at the assessed value. All of those could be looked at, and they all probably should. But unless there's some additional capacity provided within the abatement system, looking at them would not provide additional revenue and certainly wouldn't be an answer to any of the education funding issues that we're looking at. Now, just quickly switch. One of the other things that we're also looking at, because the local school support tax portion of the sales tax is also a primary funder of education. So it caused us to look at sales tax. Now, the easy thing to do when you're looking at sales tax is to look at rate. And that we've done for many, many years. I mean, I do remember, if I'm not mistaken, and again, Russ would correct me if I am, the sales tax rate in 1981 pre-tax shift was, I believe, 3.5% in the state of Nevada. In Clark County today, we're at 8.35%. So on the rate side, we've certainly had a lot of growth. What has happened on the base side? That's the side that I continue to focus on. What we've seen with the tax base for sales tax is actually a narrowing of that base over that same period of time, mostly because we've added a number of exemptions, explicit exemptions, that are encoded within NRS to the taxable sales base. Our economy has also changed and shifted away from tangible goods sold at retail to non-tangible items that would thus not be taxable under a sales tax regime, at least as we currently have it in this state. So one of the other things we're looking at is what are some of those other areas of trade which effectively account for roughly 65% of our overall economy that is not taxable through the sales and use tax as it's currently applied in Nevada. Is there anything else in that 65% of the remaining economy that would be beneficial to look at to extend some other form of excise tax to? And one of the first things that always comes up when we're talking about sales tax, and rightfully so, is regressivity. Under our existing system, we have a lot of those explicit exemptions, as I mentioned earlier, that exist to try to reduce regressivity. So those things that are necessities of life, like food purchased in grocery stores and pharmaceuticals and other items, are explicitly exempted to try to reduce the regressivity. However, are there items that are currently not sold at retail and are not tangible, which is the definition of items to be taxed under our sales tax laws in this state, that could also be looked at as a form of a revenue source that also would not increase regressivity? And our belief is the answer to that question is yes. An earlier speaker today, I think it might have been during your public comment period, gave a couple of interesting examples. You know, a book that's purchased in hard copy or paperback is taxed, but a book purchased online is not. It's the same product. And so oftentimes these changes in technology, your fiscal system oftentimes is challenged to keep up with changes in technology. And that's largely one of the things we're experiencing. So we are looking at ways that a taxable base could be expanded and an excise tax applied to that. Now, it's interesting when we look at it from the Commission on School Funding's perspective, because our task is to find funding for education. So, simply extending something into the existing sales tax regime, which is not as simple as it sounds to do, would only provide a small amount of benefit to education. Only the LSST portion would be extended to education and go into the state education fund. The basic and supplemental city county relief tax pieces would continue to go to cities and counties. The state's piece would continue to go where it goes. The other optional taxes would continue to go where they go. So it wouldn't be necessarily the best way of optimizing the opportunity to enhance education funding. Another way to do that would be to apply a separate rate to some of those areas that are not taxed under the existing sales and use tax regime, allowing for 100% of that to go to funding education throughout the state. Again, these are concepts that we're working on. They are not formalized recommendations from the Commission on School Funding. However, sometime over the course of the next couple of months, I believe we have 3 meetings left in which to finish all of the analytical work that we're doing and form those into recommendations, put them into a report to provide to you all for your consideration in the upcoming and over the next 10 years to meet the mandate that we were given to identify optimal funding and a pathway of funding that over a 10-year period. I know that's a lot, and I know you've had a very long day with a lot of information being thrown at you. Hopefully that was relatively clear about what our targets are and what we're looking at by way of potential funding methodologies. And I'd certainly be happy to address any questions that you all may have, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs. Yeah, it was a lot of information. The good thing about this committee is they're used to a lot of information, which makes them awesome. So are there any questions? Show of hands. So I have Assemblywoman Kasama, Assemblywoman Hafen. Is there anyone else that I'm missing a hand? Assemblywoman Anderson, so I can do my list. You're good? Yeah, okay. So I will start with Assemblyman Hafen and then go to Zoom.
Madam Chair, you're not going to let any of them yell at me, are you?
No.
We try not to yell here. Try is the key word. Thank you, Mr. Hobbs, for being here and giving the presentation. I just some clarifications. The calculations that you were showing for the per pupil funding did not include the new mining tax, and so those numbers will increase. And I believe you said that will cover over the 10-year period about 800 million. Is that correct?
That's our assumption at this point. And yes, the numbers that you saw on the charts that I showed did not include that yet.
Okay, so that gets us to a good portion of what the goal or the national average, I guess I should say, is. And then may I have a second question? The other one is during public comment, we had testimony saying that Nevada was 48th in per pupil funding. When I Googled it, that did not seem accurate. And so I just want to get on the record, if you know where we are, it just didn't seem to compute with what I was able to Google. I'm not saying Google's right, but I'd just like to know from you.
Well, we always go to Wikipedia first, right? That's the primary source. Those rankings, we actually, at our last Commission on School Funding meeting, had a presentation from the Gwynn Center on all of those various rankings that you all hear about. 48th here, 18th there, 26th. They're very hard to sort out. They're not apples to apples. The best comparison that we could find, very frankly, was how do we line up against national average funding? You could still have a lot of very legitimate questions about what comprises being at the national average. We understand that. But it certainly doesn't suggest that we would be at the higher end of funding on any sort of ranking basis whatsoever. And if you look at the chart that, I hope it came back up, To your point about mining taxes, if you were to take 80 million away from each of those numbers each of those years, that would be the remaining value that would need to be funded to reach the national average by the 10th year.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'll keep it to 3. And and I know this is all hypothetical and probably above my pay grade, but you're using the mining tax as an additional 80 million. I'm assuming you're not taking into any factor of either growth in the value of the tax revenue then for those mines. It's just a straight 80 million per year over the 10-year period. There's no growth. There's no CPI adjustment or anything like that.
That's a great question, and I appreciate that. At this point, we've just used the 80 million because we also recognize that mining taxes are highly volatile over time. It might be a bit optimistic to just throw, some kind of growth factor in there without also giving consideration to what a downturn might do to those taxes over time. We hope nothing. But our experience has been that we've seen notable volatility over the years.
Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hobbs, for the presentation and insights. My question is a little bit along Assemblyman Haven's questioning as well. When I look at the 2021 per pupil funding of $9,742, I know that doesn't include the mining tax, but does that include, is that strictly the state funding? Because there's also county and local municipality funding that comes into the education. So is that included in the per pupil funding, or is this only the state portion?
The local revenues that support education are also included in that value since they go through the state to be appropriated out to the school districts. So it does include those.
Thank you. I just wanted to confirm that number. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblywoman Anderson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Roca, for this information, and I promise not to yell either. You mentioned with the abatement changes, and I really appreciate you mentioning the abatement changes and how that's going to impact the county. But with the prior presentation, that there's some significant abatements that are currently in place, which again, I really appreciate you bringing forward. Has there been discussion with county officials as to how that will impact them as well? Or is that outside of the purview of this committee? And then I do have a second question as well.
To your question, it's not part of the charge of the Commission on School Funding. However, I have ongoing interaction with a number of folks at the local government level and state level about the types of things that this commission is considering. This is something that's being staffed by the Nevada Department of Education. The Attorney General has someone assigned to our committee as well. And given, my background also having included being a chief financial officer of a very large governmental entity in this state, I recognize that the potential impacts of abatements or anything to do with excise tax base are potentially going to have broader impact than just education, or potentially could have broader impact.
Thank you for that clarification. And then my second question has to do with the, for lack of a better term, I guess, the looking into the future. Because when we're looking at, and I don't know if it's a question or a comment, I'll try to make it into a question, Chair. When you're looking at the national average funding, this is what is currently what is believed to be projected. This does not, or does it reflect possible increases that other states are currently considering when they put more money into education and other public entities. I know that there are more than a few states currently considering putting more money into their education world. So is this considering those other taxes that we're investments that we're hearing about, or is this more what is currently in place, and if everything continues on that way with the projections that are presented here?
To your question, and I appreciate that one as well, as you can see on the chart that hopefully is up once again, we did anticipate that the national average funding would grow the darker bar over time. Now, my recommendation, and it will probably be included in our report to all of you, is that something like the Education Funding Commission continue over time to update these values on an annual basis, because they will change. Looking at them at one point in time is very interesting, but it's our best assessment as to what we think the future might look like. Perhaps if all of the other states increase funding for education, the gap between us and the national average would naturally close. But a lot of the other states are also facing a lot of the same issues that we are.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs, and thank you again for the presentation. Greatly appreciate it, as well as the amount of time and energy you've put into the commission. I'm sure it's been incredibly quiet during those meetings, so thank you so much for all that time and effort towards it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any additional questions? Senator Dennis, and then Senator Gansert.
I have mostly just a comment. As one who put together this new funding, helped put together the funding formula with Senator Woodhouse and I, as we were anticipating, having a new funding formula, creating this commission was so important because it would allow us to be able to look at these issues and be able to adjust what costs were and those kinds of things. And the reason I bring this up because we have a lot of new folks in the legislature, and we've never had that before. In the past, when we wanted to talk about education funding, we had to wait during a 120-day window or during a special study of some kind. So I appreciate the fact that we can have this discussion and actually talk about what it costs to educate our kids, and to be able to talk about what some of the options are to be able to get us to the levels that will be, we use the word optimal, but to get us to the levels that we need to be at to be able to educate our kids to the best that we can. And so I appreciate, Mr. Hobbs, all the work that you guys do. For me, when I created that, I kind of looked at the Education Funding Commission kind of like what we do with the Economic Forum, that gives us the ability to look at where we need to be and where we're at and where we need to be. And so I appreciate all of the folks that serve on there and that be able to give us this information so that we could have these discussions, not only during session, but especially during the interim as we prepare for new sessions. So thank you for all that work. And I appreciate, Madam Chair, being able to have this report today to bring us up to speed on that, because it's such an important topic. And we don't always get the opportunity to have in-depth discussions about these issues. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Dennis. Senator Gansert.
Thank you, Chair Neal. I want to drill down on the numbers a little bit more. And so we went from a basic support number with lots of different buckets. There was transportation or disability or textbooks and things like that, to the pupil-centered funding plan. And so in this number, in the pupil-centered funding plan, I think there's still some dollars that are outside of that, such as transportation. And so I want to know if that's in there. And then, another question I have is when we look at funding to school, the traditional public schools versus charter schools, there's dollars that are spent on capital that I don't think are included. So I don't think charter schools get transportation or capital. So that's kind of part B. And then also in this number, in addition to the pupil-centered funding plan, I know that there was a question asked about whether local support is in there. And I think, if you look at local support from an operational standpoint, that is in there. But I don't think the funds that go towards capital, towards construction are in the numbers that you have presented. So it's really about looking at this shift from basic support to pupil-centered funding plan, and are there dollars outside the pupil-centered funding plan on an individual basis that are different for regular schools versus charter schools? And then are there capital dollars anywhere in the numbers that have been presented, since those are locally derived, but they're not operating. They're different. They're sort of different, but I want to make sure we're as close to apples as we can get.
To your question, Senator Gansert, and I appreciate that, because that's something that we wrestled with in comparing Nevada's per pupil spending to the national average and to the subject matter expert recommended level. We wanted to make sure those were all on a parity basis. And we believe that they are. Now, to the point that you're raising about capital is quite significantly different between each of the school districts around the state. And the numbers that you see here do not include capital. Capital is, and that presents itself as almost a separate challenge, particularly in those counties in which you have the combined 366 cap rate constraining their ability to go out to do ballot initiatives, for example. That's quite problematic for some of your smaller districts, whereas for somebody like Clark, which I believe has a 55-cent debt rate that was voter approved to be locked in over time for capital, doesn't put them on a parity basis. Now, that's within the state of Nevada. Between the national average that we're showing and Nevada's per pupil spending, that is on an apples to apples basis exclusive of capital. But you're also right in the sense that different states across the country will also have different grant programs outside of this. They may apply for certain grants that would not be reflected in this. Just to be clear on that point. And I don't know that I answered all of your questions. Oh, charter schools was a part of it.
You covered a piece of it, knowing that capital is outside of this, and that's a huge local contribution. So you've got operating, you've got capital, they're separate buckets. And then kind of going back to the pupil-centered funding plan, and it sounds like potentially you could add 80 million for mining, but I don't know if the dollars that you're using include the funds that are outside of that, one of which is transportation. And I can't remember if funding for disability, kids with disabilities is in there or not, but I was trying to figure out what's outside and if things like transportation are included in the numbers that you're presenting.
Speaking first to what we refer to as the weighted categories, which would be for things like English language learners, special education, gifted and talented, and students at risk. Those numbers are included and on a parity basis with the comparison to the national average and the APA recommended levels of funding. In fact, that points up as one particular question that I would assume all of you would be asking if these recommendations were to come before you. If you were to spend to the national average or spend to the levels that you saw in the earlier charts each year, exactly how would those monies be deployed? And, what are the programs that would be affected by those? Now, that's not something I can speak to because my primary background is not the world of education, but that's a question that we're posing to all of the superintendents right now. And I do believe that one of those areas that is a bit deficient is reaching each of the recommended weight levels for each of those programs I just mentioned to you, special ed, English language learners, at-risk students. Those would appear to be underfunded on a recommended level.
Thank you for letting us know those are included, because those are fundamental, I think, to the per pupil funding plan or the pupil-centered funding plan. But I still think there's dollars outside of that I'm not sure if they're captured or not, whether it's transportation or other items, but we can follow up with that. Chair, I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions from members? Let's see a show of hands. Okay. So, thank you for presenting this. I just want to know in this study, how you guys are going forward. Are you guys going to be looking at, because let me frame this right. I've been focused on, what the population growth is going to be and how that may change because of other factors. And so I'm wondering, when you talk about pupils continuing to grow over a 10-year period and then you have a reduction in your population, how are you using those factors or other growth measurements into looking at your revenue numbers or revenue need? Because, and what I'm referring to, and the thing that I'm on lately, is the shift in migration because of water, right? And how ultimately what we're projecting now, and then what's a projection in 2029, will be different in terms of the population that you think you're meeting, and then also the way in which you generate the revenue.
To your question, Madam Chair, that is one of the most thrilling aspects of doing projections like this, is trying to get your arms wrapped around exactly what you're talking about. The projections that we are using as our baseline right now would include what I'd refer to as normal growth in student population over that period of time. Now, I think that goes to an earlier point that we discussed as well. Is there a need to continue to monitor all of this and recalibrate it each year? I believe that absolutely. There's a reason to do that. And we've developed these models with the hope that the state will continue to recalibrate and update those each year. But right now, the projections are based on what past growth has been. A way to get at that, and perhaps if this comes forward for legislative consideration, this is something you would ask for, is for us to run different iterations of this under different assumptions about growth rates to see how that affects the numbers.
I personally think that is important to know, because what I'm worried about is how we fund currently. We wait for crisis. We have a plan. Here comes crisis, and then all of a sudden we really want to do revenue. But I think that while we're in a position to think about all of those multiple factors that are probably going to come into play, we should be building models that have all of those assumptions in the model so that we can know, well, if this occurs, if we were to flatline, here's the effect on this property tax idea that we're considering, or this combination, right? Because it looks like from what you said, it's probably going to be a combination, two-part. It could have an abatement piece. It could have some other piece. But I think how that, the structure of the revenue matters. And it matters because it is being built based on this growth pattern that may or may not come into existence. And then your people have put decisions in place and saying, well, I made this decision and now I need the money that I made the decision for 2025.
That's an exceptionally important point. And just, by way of a little bit more insight to some things that the commission has discussed. I ran the commission through an exercise of looking at principles of taxation that I'm sure all of you have seen a number of times, things like sufficiency, stability, predictability, equity, ease of administration. There's a very lengthy list of those. And at the forefront of this, given the magnitude, sufficiency was determined by a number of members of the commission to be a very high priority. But predictability and stability were also identified as top priorities, and that only makes sense, right? If you're investing in something as important as education, you would like to know that the revenue sources that you're committing to it are going to be stable and reliable, and you're not going to have to adjust your level of programming in the future because of volatility in one or two of the key revenue sources. And that's, I think part of I'll refer to as ancient underpinnings of property tax was a virtually 100% reliable revenue pre-abatement. You knew what a penny of property tax was going to generate, and it would generate that each successive year. And as more assessed valuation came in, you had growth. You didn't have to go through the calculations of pre and post abatement. That stabilized funding for a lot of services throughout the state, including education. Sales tax, we've certainly come to learn in the last 15 years, there can be volatility in taxable sales. Particularly when you consider a county like Clark that is 20% reliant on eating and drinking establishments and tourism and the effects of recessions and pandemics and other such things as you look out into the future, which goes back to your point. It does make sense to try to model a number of different scenarios. Again, this is baseline that we're looking at. We could look at a more conservative, a more optimistic, and one that would assume, and this is just hypothetical, what if we went into a 2-year recession in 2030 and 31? How would that affect the revenues? I mean, those are all things that can be done. And I think that's all something that should be considered when you're, putting together your portfolio, because that's really what it is, a portfolio of revenues to support state services and in particular education. You want it to be stable, reliable, and predictable over time.
Thank you for that response. So we will go ahead. Oh, Senator Dennis?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a clarification. Senator Ganser brought up some issues earlier, and I just wanted to clarify. Transportation costs are not in the pupil-centered funding plan. The reason for that is that they are different. Because when we looked at when we created it, we looked at that, and those costs vary so much between rural and whatever. So those did not get included. The other ones that are not included is nutritional. Everything else, he already addressed the capital costs. Those are outside because each county has the ability to raise their own. Every other revenue that has been set aside for education is all in the big the fund. So I just want to make sure to clarify that there's not a bunch of other little things out there that are not in the funding. So we are now able to compare ourselves with all the costs that it takes to educate outside, except for the nutrition and the transportation, because those are costs that just vary, and nobody has a way to compare that as well from state to state as we're looking at those costs. So I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. All right. So I thank you, Mr. Hobbs, for coming and updating us, and we look forward to that study when it's done. And so it should be interesting. So we're going to close out this presentation, and then we're going to go to Mr. Acroft. We're going to jump to agenda item number 8 and the presentation on exemptions allowed for a portion of the value of the property for qualified low-income housing.
Good afternoon. Yep. Good afternoon, Chair Neal, Vice Chair Cohen, members of the committee. For the record, Steve Acroft, Administrator of the Nevada Housing Division. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss this topic. Thank you for bumping me up a little bit. I certainly appreciate that. And I promise I will try to be thorough, but relatively quick here. So I think in order to better understand the need for the property tax exemption on affordable properties, I kind of want to do a comparison of the development of an affordable property versus that of a market rate property. So please bear with me as I kind of walk you through this. Going back to the way a market rate property is developed, I'm sure some of you have heard of the 5 L's of construction, which is land, labor, lumber, laws, and loans. You assemble all of those together, you determine the cost to build, cost to operate, and then based on those numbers, You need to recoup those costs, create reserves, make a profit, respond to the market, and you make your determination of rental rates. And so just for sake of argument, because it's going to work a little better when I get to the math portion of this presentation, $1,500 a month is determined to be your going rate for a one-bedroom apartment. So now let's look at how an affordable development is built. And the first thing I want to mention is there has to be somebody participating in this field who's a little bit magnanimous and benevolent. And that's without getting into the compliance and regulatory burdens which are placed on the developer, just focusing here on the financial componentry. Second thing is your tenants will be restricted at being a maximum of 60% of area median income. So you still have the 5 L's, land, labor, laws, lending, and they're not necessarily cheaper for building an affordable property. You still need to recoup construction costs, create reserves, make enough money to pay staff, ensure the financial stability of the development, but you can only rent to those who are of 60% of area median income. So while it truly doesn't work this way, again, for simplicity's sake, you're not going to be able to collect market rate rents. You are contractually bound to rent at a lower rate. Heard it earlier, the HUD rates, and effectively, you're only going to be, again, for some simple math, able to collect 60% of what market rate is. So instead of collecting $1,500 for a one-bedroom apartment, you'll only collect $900. And that's a $600 per month deficit on one unit. It's a 100-unit complex. That's $60,000 per month, roughly $750,000 annually. That results in an unsustainable financial structure. So that's where the division comes in combination with our low-income housing tax credit program provided through the federal government, which we administer. It's done through a private-public partnership. And with that tax credit program, equity is created that will significantly reduce the cost of lending. Effectively, because we are reducing that loan L, equity is replacing debt, and the developer doesn't have to borrow as much money. So that immediately results in the project becoming more sustainable. You then can bring in other layers of subsidy, affordable housing trust funds, federal home loan bank grants, and this will ultimately result in what some of you I'm sure have heard of, the lasagna financing that enables these projects to pencil. But that still doesn't get us there. That does help in the construction of the project, but doesn't really help in the operational end of things. So for that 30-year affordability period, we need to somehow reduce the burden on the developer in that manner. And so another way to assist in this endeavor is to lower the property tax burden on the property. And NRS 361-082, which has been demonstrated or indicated in a couple of previous presentations, allows for the exemption of property tax for qualified low-income housing projects. This is specifically done through a reference to HUD-provided home funds via the Cranston-Gonzalez National Affordable Housing Act. And annually, the state and local jurisdictions of Clark County, Las Vegas, Reno, and Henderson receive home funds directly. For your edification, in the federal fiscal year for 2022, that amount statewide is going to be $12.5 million. In this lasagna financing I've described, we're going to sprinkle just a little bit of these home funds. And this is always done with the local jurisdiction's knowledge or by that local jurisdiction to receive the property tax exemption. So in our typical property, this can result in about an annual savings of $350,000 per year for each year of that affordability period. Ultimately, it makes these projects much more financially sound, lowers the risk profile, and enables them to be affordable for that 30-year time frame. Typically, it's an incredibly small but critical component of the capital stack. that has that layered lasagna financing. And it's incredibly important, particularly here in Nevada, because it does trip that property tax exemption. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions. If Assemblyman Hafen has 3, I'm ready for them. If anybody else has any, I'm ready for them too.
Thank you, Mr. Acroft. Any questions from members? I can't really see the Zoom. Does anybody have a show of hands? So there's no questions? Okay. All right then. I can't believe nobody has any questions. Okay. So I don't have any because I think I asked mine in a prior meeting, Private Activity Bond Council. But okay then. Well, thank you, Mr. Acroft, for presenting this information.
Thank you.
Okay, so then that moves us to actually agenda item number 7, which is the fiscal analysis division on the presentation on hypothetical and actual information on property tax values. Since it's 3:54, we have time.
This is Russell getting in with the fiscal analysis. Madam Chair, what I can try and do is go through it a little quicker than probably intended. And then there is a lot of information in the packet for this agenda. There's 2 additional exhibits, but those are more informational. And I will try before we shut down today to make the comments, because those tables will supplement the presentations that have been made for the other agenda items, as well as the questions that were made by the members and the answers provided. But let me share my screen here. And so what you should have is a set of tables, and let me try and blow them up here a little bit, that begin on page 51 of the meeting packet. And so what these tables attempt to do, and realize they look pretty complex and complicated, and potentially they are, because I think you've learned that from the discussion on property taxes today, that any discussions about property taxes can get complicated. But what I've tried to do here is to create some work product that we can go through quickly today. But as Mr. Hobbs has stated for his agenda item, that you have the Commission on School Funding with its statutory duties to look at potential funding sources for K-12 education. One of those is potential changes to the property tax. So working with Chair Neal, then the tax team tried to put together some information that on property taxes to address some of the functional elements of our current property tax system, and then the potential to make changes to those and what could happen. Not just this interim, but also if the Commission on School Funding's recommendations have to come forward to the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Education, and those possibly could be a topic for discussion in the 2023 session. So with that as sort of the premise for creating these tables, what these tables do is use hypotheticals because of all the functional elements of the property tax system, it becomes hard to find real world examples to allow you to demonstrate the points that you're trying to make when, as your staff trying to go through the property tax system and make changes and show you the effects of those. So decided here, you can see in table 1, let's consider this as FY 2005, the fiscal year before the legislature approved the property tax partial abatements in the 2005 session that became effective for FY 2006. So what I've done here is you have 7 different houses. And so you should have one that's 50 years old, 40 years old, 30 years old, 20 years old, 10 years old, 1 year old, and brand new. It came on the property tax roll in FY 2005. So they're trying to simplify things. And I know the assessors probably would, go, wow, this is an oversimplification. Yeah, it probably is, but I need to make certain assumptions and control certain elements to make it simpler to try and make the point that's trying to be made. So here you can see shaded in gray, the land value for all 7 houses is the same, irrespective of their age. The replacement cost is the same at $150,000. So you have $70,000 in land, $150,000 in replacement cost for the improvements that are on the land. So you can see the next line here is depreciation, as you heard today, it's 1.5% per year times the number of years old for the improvements, but it's for 50 years, so it caps out at the 75% is the max. So you can see here then the 50-year-old home has a depreciation factor of 75%, and then as you go across to the 40 to 30, you see the depreciation factor going down because as the improvements are younger, then you get less depreciation. So then you take the depreciation factor times $150,000 to get the amount of depreciation. And you can see that on the line here. And as you would expect, the more depreciation, the larger the depreciation factor because the home is older, then you have more depreciation. So then you subtract that amount of depreciation from the replacement cost to get what by statute, we call it the improvements, which is the replacement cost less depreciation that you heard referenced. So then the taxable value before depreciation would be the $220,000. But after depreciation, you can see how the value, the taxable value differs based on the age of the home. So that's what you heard today about the calculating the taxable value based on the current statutory provisions. So then the next block here in the darker, with the darker orange highlighted set off, is you're just going to take those respective lines above for taxable value times 35%. That's assessed value. So then you heard, well, that's what we apply the tax rates to then to determine your taxes. So in FY 2005 here, before the partial abatements, and I just put in here in the green highlighted area, if you took the tax rate times the assessed value before depreciation, you can see that every house would have the same property tax liability, $2,818. But in the orange section here, the tax due after depreciation, you can see it remains at the $2,818 for the new home because they don't get any depreciation. But then you can see how the tax goes down based on the assessed value after depreciation, which that was the property tax system in place through FY 2005, which is you take the tax rate, and here I'm assuming it's the maximum rate, the $3.66 dollars per $100 of assessed value. So this table then allows you to see how different age homes that have the same land value and the same replacement cost have this different tax liability because of the depreciation. Now, I do want to point out for the members of the committee that you hear the statement about, well, that Nevada is the only state that has depreciation or depreciation. Like, I want to be careful there that Nevada is potentially the only state that has this statutory construct that you get 1.5% per year times the age of the improvements. I believe every state, including Nevada, they always have a construct for depreciation, or you heard the other term obsolescence, because it occurs to property. In fact, the 1.5% depreciation that we're talking about was put in place by the legislature in the 1983 session. Prior to that, we were we had a construct where we weren't on taxable value, we were on full cash value, which you can think about as being market value. But we still had provisions in the law that said assessors had to look at, one of the things they can look at as the value of the land, even at the full cash value, and then the improvements, but subtracting the amount of depreciation or obsolescence based on the age of the improvements. So I just wanted to make that slight clarification that depreciation isn't a new thing in Nevada law for property, and it's probably a thing that you're going to see across all states because property depreciates, especially if you don't do a very good job of keeping it up. You may have the assessor may have to go out and look at obsolescence or depreciation that's going on. And so I just want to make that it's possibly true. I'm not an expert on the other 49 state statutes, but we're probably the only one that has this fixed rate of 1.5% depreciation by law. So then what I did down here in the lower block of this table is just to try and calculate the different effective tax rates. And so what this is the construct here is like when we file our federal income taxes, we're writing down our wage income or other income to get to our total income. And then you get to take certain deductions or credits depending on the nature of you as a taxpayer. And then you're going to get to a net tax. Well, if you take that net amount of tax paid and divide it into your total income, that's your effective tax rate, which is generally less than the statutory tax rate. Say you're in a 20% tax bracket, your effective tax rate is going to be less than that because of you get deductions or credits. So here you can see that the tax rate for this $100 of assessed value after depreciation is the tax rate, the $3.66. But depending on the age of the home, the effective rate goes down once you start accounting for the depreciation and accounting for you move from taxable value to assessed value by taking it times 35%. So you can see for the examples here that the brand new home had the effective tax rate of $1.28 per $100 of assessed value of taxable value, which that would be the value that the assessor says on your home and in the land before doing any depreciation and before doing any 35% reduction to get the assessed value, versus the 50-year-old home has an effective tax rate of approximately 63 cents per $100 of assessed value. So I just wanted to spend a little bit more time so you as members, what this table is presenting and how to sort of read it. So then the next table goes and looks at table 2 is FY 2006. So that was the first year of the partial abatements. So so you can see each one of the homes gets 1 year older, but I've also added a brand new home under the tax roll as house 8 compared to the prior table. And so again, to try and control the structural elements and for the results here, I've assumed land and improvements for every one of these houses increases by 5%. From FY 2005 to FY 2006, the land and the improvements, the replacement costs they both have increased by 5%, but they stay the same. So you go from the 70,000 to the 73,500, and you go from the 150,000 to the 157,500 for the land and replacement cost of the improvements for every house. So you can see for the 51-year-old house, it doesn't gain any more depreciation. They were maxed out at the 75%, but the depreciation for every other house goes up by the 1.5%, except for the new home, because you don't get any depreciation in the first year. Again, taking it times 35%, you get the assessed value. And what I've kept here is the green block, which is the taxes before depreciation. But now I'm going to show you the taxes before and after taking into account the partial abatement. And here the partial abatement factor is the 3%, because I'm trying to do a single family owner occupied home at the 3%. Then the orange block again is the tax due after depreciation, before and after partial abatements. So it is this. So you can see the tax due on your assessed value after depreciation here at the first line under the orange highlighted line. Again, you can see the brand new home pays the full rate at the full value, the $29.59, but then the tax before partial abatement goes down again, but it's because of depreciation. Now the next line you can see, well, those, except for the new home, because it's also not eligible for any partial abatements, as you heard today, it pays the same before and after partial abatements. But then the tax you see with the 3% partial abatement in place, your taxes from FY 2005 for FY 2006 can only go up by 3%. Thus, you don't pay the amount that you would have paid before the partial abatement. You pay the amount after the partial abatement. And then I've actually showed you in the line partial abatement, the amount of the partial abatement you got for each house because you could only go up by 3% versus going up basically the 5% that you would have gone up given the growth rule that I was using for this example. So again, down here in the bottom, I show you the effective tax rates as you can see across the age of the homes. So then so I could simulate this and build tables that again can be used. I've showed you FY 2010. So I've allowed all the land and replacement for the improvements every year between FY 2006 and 2005 grow by 5% a year to get these land and replacement cost values. And I've also then the age of the home goes up by 4 more years from FY 2006, and you add more depreciation. And so then I'm calculating the taxes, and you can see now the amount of the partial abatement is getting bigger. And then I'm showing you the cumulative amount of partial abatements, which was a term that Mr. Hobbs referenced about, hey, what you have abatements that concur for a fiscal year, but then they can accumulate the amount of the partial abatements on a property. So that's what you're seeing here. And again, you can see it over the age of the homes. And here I've added a house 9 as a new home and that came online in FY 2010. And again, you can see that home pays the full rate times their assessed value because they're not eligible for depreciation and they're not eligible for partial abatement compared to the existing homes that get older each year. And so again, in table 4, it's just going another 5 years out, which would be the 10th year of the partial abatement since they became effective in FY 2015. And again, growing land and the replacement cost at 5% a year. And again, you can see now house 2 has actually gotten to 50 years. So it's reached its maximum depreciation. And so I'm not going to go through the 2015. So finally get to FY 2020, which would just be the 15th year of the partial abatement since it became effective. And you can see the houses there that how old they are now in FY 20 for those that were existing, and then also added a new house. And again, it's all the same mechanics of the assumption of growing things by 5% a year so that they have identical land values, replacement costs. What's driving the difference in the taxable value is depreciation. What's then driving the difference in the taxes due is the partial abatements. So you can start to see the accumulative level of the partial abatements, as well as the order of magnitude of the partial abatements increases. If under this assumption where I keep having you grow at 5% to try and keep you growing above the 3% cap. And then again, you can see the effective tax rates between a new home and as the homes get older, as a percent of your taxable value before depreciation. Again, under that construct of trying to think about what did you pay in taxes as a percent of the value before you got to make any adjustments to that value under this income. So that's tables 1 through 5 are trying to show you is you can see here the mechanics or the functional elements of the property tax system for different age homes that was explained to you by the assessors, Department of Taxation, and the questions and answers. So what I've done then is tried to take, as Mr. Hobbs was discussing, the Commission on School Funding as an entity looking into doing the study of property taxes and what are some of the potential changes you can make to the property tax structure under the current statutory structure, and how would that look? So in table 5A here, I'm just taking FY 2020, so it was the table 5 that we just looked at, but for 5A here, depreciation is a statutory construct. So the legislature could come in, and what I'm assuming here is the legislature came in and said, you know what, no more 1.5% depreciation times the number of years old, it's 0. So you can see I'm zeroing out the depreciation, and then you can see then the replacement costs and the improvements, replacement cost less depreciation become the same. And so then you work through this and I'm calculating the tax. So it's like table 5, just table 5A eliminates the 1.5% per year depreciation factor, which is a statutory construct which the legislature can change. So it's actually easier by then looking at table 6A. It's showing you the difference between 5A minus the numbers or results in table 5. So again, here you see, because we're changing depreciation, you see the changes occurring in the taxable value block of this table. Why? Because making changes to the depreciation factor changes taxable value. And then because you got to take the taxable value times 35%, you change assessed value. But you can see I don't change the taxes due before depreciation. But you can see the taxes changing after depreciation. But notice here, the taxes before partial abatements would go up. And you can see, as would be expected, that the older homes are going to have a much larger increase in their tax liability because you're adding back for the 65 and 55-year-old homes, you're adding back 75% of the value. So you can see the order of magnitude of the increases in taxes that would occur if you got rid of this 1.5% and just said no depreciation. Now, again, to offer, as the point I made at the beginning of this, if you did such a thing and left in that taxable, you left the current construct for how assessors are going to determine the taxable value, and that taxable value can't exceed the market value, then I wouldn't be surprised that many of the assessors in these counties, they're going to have to go in and put obsolescence on some of the properties. Why? Because they would end up with taxable value probably exceeding the market value. So they'd have to go, there'd still have to be quote unquote obsolescence, or you can think of it as depreciation, just no longer the statutory 1.5% per year. But then what you look is the tax due here after partial abatement, it's 0, meaning that the amount of taxes due after partial abatements, after removing the depreciation factor, they did not change compared to what it would have been in table 5 with the 1.5% per year. And this is the point that Mr. Hobbs was making about, you can see here that you can make changes to the value side of the structure of our property tax system, but it can result in no increase in taxes for the property, because if you're already abated out at whether it's the 3% or the alternative abatement, then increasing your value just increases the amount of partial abatements. It doesn't increase your tax liability. And then table 5B it's a scenario where you take table 5 for FY 2020, and you, again, as Mr. Hobbs referenced, you change the 35% factor to 40%. So you're going to increase that 35% by 5% to 40%. Again, you redo the calculations, but I'll go to table 6B, which shows you, again, the difference between 5B and table 5. Well, we didn't do anything to depreciation. So the taxable value, there is no change. Where the changes are occurring is in the assessed value portion of the table. Why? Because you increased the 35% by 5% to 40%. So again, that's the tables are trying to set up to allow you to see what's functionally going on as you make changes to things. But once again here, you can see in the orange section is the tax due after depreciation. Your taxes would go up before the partial abatement. There is no increase in your taxes after partial abatement. Why? Because every one of these homes, I've set it up so that they're already getting the 3% abatement. So any increase in the value that would result in an increase in taxes before partial abatement results in no increase in taxes after the partial abatement. Table 5C is the scenario where everything's the same in table 5, except for you're going to increase the tax rate by 10 cents per $100 of assessed value. So the tax rate goes from $3.66 to $3.76 per $100 of assessed value. And again, it doesn't really matter whether you think of this as being a new rate or you're increasing an existing rate, but here it's inside the partial abatements for the purposes of the mathematics. So again, you can see going to table 6C, that's on page 61 of the packet, we're not doing anything to either taxable value or assessed value. So here in this case, we've done nothing to affect what the county assessors have to do, because we're not requiring them to make any change to how to determine your value. But again, you drop down, we're changing the tax rate by increasing it by the 10 cents. But again, because I'm assuming this rate is inside the partial abatements, your taxes before partial abatement would go up. And you can see they actually go up more the younger the home is compared to the older home, because why? You got more value there because you're not getting as much depreciation. But the tax due after partial abatement, again, 0. There's no change, because why? The home was already fully abated out at the 3%. So these are the 3 examples where you can change depreciation. And in the first scenario, you can change the 35% factor for converting taxable value to assessed value. And here you could increase the rate, and it could be a new rate, and a totally new rate, or it could be a increase in an existing, but you get no increase. So then the last scenario here is in table 5D, is we're going to increase, it's table 5, but we're going to increase the abatement cap from 3% to 6%. So we're not making any change to the depreciation. We're not making any change to the 35% factor, and we're not changing the tax rate. It's table 5. We're just increasing the partial abatement factor, doubling it from 3% to 6%, and thus we're recalculating the taxes. So then we go to table 6D, and you can see okay, you don't here, you have no changes in the taxes before partial abatement, because we did not mess with value or tax rates. We're messing with the partial abatements. So now you can finally see you get an increase in the tax due after partial abatements. So this is what Mr. Hobbs was referencing about, that under our current statutory structure for property taxes, that we had a system that where once the partial abatements came in place, if you can make changes, and I don't mean to imply that if you would make changes to the value or the rate, you wouldn't pick up some revenue, because potentially not every parcel may be fully abated out, depending on what the abatement percentages end up being, especially for the property that may be at, say, an 8% partial abatement versus a 3%. But you can clearly then see what happens here is, for like this home, the new home doesn't pay any more taxes because they were already paying the full rate at the full value. So when you decide to make changes to the partial abatement cap factors, you're going to pick up the additional revenue from the property that was existing on the roll in the prior tax year. That's where the additional revenue comes from when you change or increase the partial abatement factor. So that's, if you have a chance to look to these tables, that's one of the things to look at, is you're making these changes to keep in mind where the distribution of the effects would be if there is any change because of the partial abatements that are in play, but to keep in mind, well, who's being impacted? Older homes, well, existing homes versus new homes. And within the existing homes category, is it more the older homes or the newer homes in terms of the magnitude of the change and the potential tax liability? Again, assuming that to get revenue of any order of magnitude, you have to give consideration to changing the partial abatement factor. So, and then what I just wanted to quickly show you here is, these are just the charts to try and help you visualize. So the first chart, chart 1, it's just showing you the total taxable value, which is the land and improvements before depreciation. So you can see that if you had a system based on taxable value, then the value is the same for every age of home as it increases over time for each of the reference periods that I've done the calculations for. Chart 2, and one of the things to keep, as you're looking at these charts, I keep the scale on the left side the same. So chart 2 shows you what the assessed value would be before the depreciation. So you're just taking account of the 35%. So you can see how much you're reducing that taxable value to get to assessed value in terms of just the order of magnitude of that element of the state's property tax system. And then chart 3 shows you then, well, now I'm going to bring in depreciation. So now you're going to start to see the bars be lower for the older homes as expected because of depreciation. But I've kept the scale. So right, you can just, if you would flip between the charts, you can start to see how, starting with taxable value at full cash value for land and replacement costs for improvements, and then you got to go in and add the 35% to get to assessed value, and then you got to add in depreciation, how that changes the value to which you're going to end up applying a tax rate. So then chart 4 is just graphing the tax due on assessed value after depreciation, but before the 3% partial abatement. Chart 5 shows you after the partial abatement. And so I apologize, I couldn't figure out how in Excel to get these bars in the same chart. So it's hard for you to see, well, they look the same to me. So chart 6 is actually taking the ratio of chart 5 to chart 4 to show you the effect of the partial abatements in terms of the taxes that were actually due and payable after partial abatements versus the taxes that would have been due without partial abatements under our current statutory tax system. And then finally, chart 7 is just showing you those effective tax rates that are sitting at the bottom of each one of those tables in terms of the effective tax rate per $100 of assessed value after depreciation, before depreciation. And then the last chart, the last chart here of this effective rate is chart 9. So this just shows you what the effective tax rate is per $100 of taxable value before accounting for depreciation. Just to give you the idea of what is the effective tax rate. We talk about this $3.66 as the maximum, but remember, that's the rate that's imposed per $100 of assessed value. So what if you took into account taxable value before depreciation as the tax base? This then shows you the effective tax rate. And then finally, chart 10 here, is showing you just for FY 2020, some of those scenarios that I was going through. And so the first block here is showing you the taxes due by the age of the home after depreciation, but before the partial abatement in FY 2020. Here's what the second block of bars would be FY 2020 after depreciation and after the partial abatement. So you can start to see the reduction that's occurring in FY 2020 because of the partial abatements. FY 2020 shows you what the taxes would be if you would eliminate depreciation, but retain the partial abatement. Well, as we showed in those tables, there's no difference. These bars between the two blocks are the same. That's you've made a change to how to determine value, but because these homes are already fully abated out, there's no change in the tax. So then FY 2020 shows you to eliminate depreciation and the partial abatements, which could be done statutorily because the depreciation and the partial abatements are statutory constructs. So then you could see you would equalize the taxes for each of the age of homes, but then you can look at this bar compared to its corresponding bar to just try and visualize the order of change in the amount of taxes due based on the age of the home. And finally here, I just put in, you go, well, the bars look the same for the slabs. And I just put in here because it's come up in the conversations. I believe it's one of the things that potentially the Commission on School Funding may have the entity look into as an option. It was SGR 14 that was brought up in 2017 and then was back on the list of bills for 2019, is this thing of resetting depreciation and the partial abatement upon sale, which requires a constitutional amendment. But you can see that, well, look, if you did that, then you would end up in the same place. But remember, this would be this block here, the second from the right, it's not dependent upon the sale. So this block would only be for homes that sell would get this increase in taxes because you're going to reset the depreciation and the partial abatements upon the sale. So if you think about it, if a 50-year-old home that was 50 years old in 2005 sold in FY 2020, you can see what its taxes would be. But a 50-year-old home that didn't sell, it would be back here at this level of taxes in the middle block. So that's one of the things just to keep in mind is that as I look at it, you currently have a property tax system that it's tied to the property and the value of the property, independent of the owner. In some sense, it can be dependent on what the owner is doing with the property. But we don't, that in terms of what I mean by that is when was the property taken into possession by the current owner? That is it was sold or transferred from one owner to another. Our current property tax system, as you heard today, it doesn't care about that. They're supposed to determine the land at full cash value, the improvements at replacement cost, less the depreciation. And so if you sit here and you look at this middle block and go, well, maybe I don't like this differential in taxes that are occurring between properties based on the age, but you can see in my examples, they had identical land value and improvement values before depreciation. But you can get these differentials in taxes because of depreciation and the partial abatements can play a role. So you say, well, I want to do something about that. So I'm going to, if you go to a reset on sale of the depreciation and the partial abatements, well, for those homes that sold, you'll potentially equalize. But for now, since you're going to tie that property tax system to the owner, and when the owner took possession of the property and then reset how to calculate the value and the taxes, then you would start to have bars that would look like this for the same age homes, right? That if you walk through a neighborhood that had it was built and it's a bunch of 40-year-old homes, well, depending on which homes sold and when, could potentially have tax liabilities that the bars would look like this Middleton. Because you're going to now say, hey, depending on when you're sold, I'm going to reset your value and reset your taxes. So I just wanted to go through that in terms of this concept of resetting on sale, yes, it can start to do this in terms of potentially trying over time, it could try and equalize similarly valued homes of different ages, but similarly valued homes of the same age may also now have to have significantly different tax liabilities because of what they sold. And also the legislature would have to figure out what a sale and a transfer means. Because if you had provisions where if a parent sells it to their child and that's not deemed to be a sale, then you could now start to have similarly situated taxpayers in terms of their demographic or economic characteristics that they bought 40-year-old homes side by side, and one's tax doesn't have to go up because you're not going to deem it to be a sale because they bought it from their parents, and versus the person right next to them bought the home but wasn't able to buy it from the parent. then those two homes will have vastly different tax liability. So I just wanted to start to get that information out there on this property tax system in terms of the current statute, making changes to it, and then sort of this concept of reset on sale that is now going to tie to when the property comes into the ownership or possession of the current property owner, and that now triggers something to make them look different, even though their home has the same age or characteristics of another home that didn't sell. So if you don't like this potential issue under the current statutory structure, reset on sale could start to have something look like this, but it wouldn't look like this across homes of different ages. It could look like that of homes of the same age in characteristics. And so, Madam Chair, that was the information I wanted to present. I'm just going to quickly go through the other tables that were created as part of the tax team's work product based on conversation with Senator Neal to start creating some information on property taxes for potential use this interim, given the Commission on School Funding is looking into making proposals to make changes to property taxes, and thus it could be an issue for the 2023 session. This table here, beginning on page, I believe it's 75, it's an actual home. And it goes back to when it was first on the roll. And so to let you see real world data for the land value, the replacement cost, the depreciation occurring, and then what's happening on the value side, but then what's happening on the tax side. And then as you remember, as you enter into FY 2006, that's where you see the partial abatement starting to occur. And then I'm showing you the tax before and after partial abatement and the amount of partial abatements for this property. And so one of the things as you look through this, if you have time, is you go to the second page, you'll see here in FY 2011, 2012, 13. Well, the land value was going down and the improvement were going down. So the taxable value and the assessed value were decreasing. But if you go look at the tax due on line 21, after a partial abatement, it was still going up 3%. So that's another element to keep in mind. And you heard it somewhat referenced in today's discussions about, well, depending on what side of the fence you're standing on, with regards to partial abatements, it's a good thing and it might not be such a good thing. Because what the partial abatements do are somewhat stabilizing a property owner's tax liability, but then they're also stabilizing the amount of revenue for the people who are trying to get revenue from their tax rate. And so you can see as, okay, those two parties may have different views of what the partial abatements are doing. But you can see that when as you go through business cycles in the value of your property, well, if it's going to increase by more than 3%, you can't go up by more than 3%. But there can be cycles where your taxes would have gone down, but they don't. They still go up by 3%, but you're still paying less than what you would have paid potentially at your tax rate times your assessed value after depreciation, because that's the maximum amount that you can pay is the actual tax rate times your value. So the partial abatements can keep you below that amount, and that's really the ceiling. So I wanted to show you, here's a real world example of a house and what it looks like. And also seeing that the combined property tax rate was going up, going down, going up, going down. And that may or may not generate additional taxes depending on what was going on with your value and whether you were above or below the 3% or the 0.2 partial abatement cap factor, because this home was in a county that went to. Then what I put in here is, and you heard this discussed, and I thought this after looking at some of the slides, this is actually the table that shows you for every year the partial abatement has been in place. The partial abatement cap factors for this what I call the single family owner occupied or the qualified rental cap, and then the alternative cap, what the actual cap factor was for each county by the fiscal year. So the ones that are highlighted in orange, those are years where the partial abatement cap was below 3%. Thus, both caps, the single family owner occupied and the alternative, were below 3. And then the green ones are just highlighting, those are the ones where it was at the maximum 8%. And so this was sort of mentioned, and you saw Ms. Johnson actually presented for 3 counties. Here's the table that shows you for every county, for every fiscal year. And then lying behind that, if you are even more morbidly curious, this is showing you what was being discussed about how we determine the alternative partial abatement cap factor. So in the blue, it's showing you what for each fiscal year by county, what the what the cap factor would be based on the 10-year moving average in assessed value. Then what was the 2 times CPI? And remember, it's the greater of those two, but not to exceed 8%. And again, the floor would be the 0%. And then the 3% for single family and less in those particular counties where in fiscal years where the alternative abatement cap went below 3%. So that's just the details that's lying behind it. And these are tables that we put together and we keep out there. And so, Madam Chair, that was the information. The last thing I wanted to mention is an additional exhibit that's outside the packet, because one set of the tables is actually legal size paper. And this gets to, I think, sort of Assemblywoman Anderson's questions about the tax district's tax rates. It's labeled the agenda item 5, and it's the property tax rates for it's the agenda item 7, property tax rates for FY23. There's a detailed and then a summary. So the summary table is actually showing you the property tax rates for the different taxing entities within a county. And then it's highlighted in red is when they're actually at the maximum 3.66. And then it's telling you the number of districts that are at that rate, each rate. And then it's just calculating, showing you the difference. If they are below the 366 cap, how much difference is there? And so this got to where Mr. Hobbs was referencing that for these entities that are at the $3.66, they, even if there might be an entity within that area that could raise their rate, they have room for their individual rate to increase, they can't. Because once the rate in that taxing district hits $3.66, then nobody can raise their rate. And so you can see this is, as Mr. Hobbs referenced, that would be one of the things that would have to be considered as to whether, if you wanted to go, say, increase the 75-cent school rate by, say, 10 cents to 85 cents, then to have it generate revenue, you'd have to put it outside the partial abatements. Then you'd have to give, the legislature would have to give consideration as to whether they're going to put the 10 cents outside the $3.66 or give consideration to raising this current statutory rate of 3.64. Again, remembering, as Mr. Mitchell stated, that there's a 2-cent state debt rate that was approved in the 2003 session by the legislature that was placed outside the 364 cap as a 2-cent rate. And it's tied to the Q1 conservation and water resource bonds, just for to provide some additional information on that to what Mitchell had stated. And so that's that table. Then the detailed table is the companion table. And it actually goes in and shows you, and this is information just being extracted from the, it's called the Red Book, for those that have been around here long enough to know that this document that the Department of Taxation prepares, that's very detailed, showing you the tax rates for each of the tax districts in each county. It's showing you the state's rate, the school district rate, and the city rate, a county rate, and then there can be special districts. And so if you go to the Clark County section, you'll start to see what Ms. Johnson was referring to as all the different tax districts that are in place, and then the rates that make up the combined rate for those tests. So, Madam Chair, I just wanted to get that out there for the members here today, because I think this information that, based on your conversation with staff, that we decided to compile. And some of this, we just keep it updated because property tax discussions are not a new thing. We've trying to keep some of these tables updated, but thought they would be worth adding to the record for this meeting, given the other agenda items that you had and to have available to your members and the public. as the discussions on property tax may proceed forward or into session. And with that, those were the statements that I wanted to make. And if there are any questions and the chair wants to go longer, or again, if any of the members would like, they have questions or would like us to go through any of this information in a little more detail, please just let us know. And we can make ourselves to the members to go through this, because I think it's done the chair's thing. It is important to have an understanding of the current property tax system if the legislature is going to give any consideration to proposals to make changes to it. And because it is a thing that has some moving elements to the functional structure of it, I appreciate the chair allowing us to put this information out there, and we're willing to answer questions during the meeting or after. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ginden. Members, do any of you have any questions? Assemblywoman Kasama, and okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ginden, for your charts, your work. They're brilliant, really, and I know you spent incredible hours, you and your staff, on putting these things together, and I just find them to be extremely useful. So thank you so much for that. Just a couple of comments and or questions. I agree with you that the reset doesn't work. I know it because you end up with if you have two like houses in a community, you have them paying completely separate tax into the state coffers. And I know that's been a big problem in California. Secondly, when you're talking about obsolescence versus depreciation, that we're one of the few states that has depreciation, but others allow for obsolescence, it seems to me that if we're using taxable value the same as market value, we would be taking that into account. So if we had two 50-year-old homes, and one has been remodeled, completely kept up, and one is dilapidated, their ages are the same. But if we're using market value for our taxable value, that will be taken into account because we're going to show one is improved and better than the other, even though the age is the same. And then you would have differences taking, let's say, our 35% value for taxable value. And of course, by doing market value, you can always change the taxable rate and the individual tax rates. But it seems to me we don't need to deal with depreciation or obsolescence if we're using more of a market value at any point. Does that seem correct to you?
That's a very good observation and question, Assemblywoman. And this is possibly maybe something better for the assessor to address. But as your sort of tax person as LCB staff, I wasn't around, so I don't know, as not being a native Nevadan, and even if I was, my age would have probably prohibited me from caring much about property taxes. But prior to 1981, the statutory construct for property taxes was full cash value for land for the property. So that was land and the improvements. But the statutory provisions allowed for taking into account, hey, depreciation or obsolescence on the improvements, even though you were at full cash value. How that would have worked in the real world in terms of what assessors were doing, but we had a full cash value, and I would then use market value for full cash value. Mm-hmm. The definition for full cash value was what was that willing price paid between two willing buyer and seller, and all conditions requisite for a fair sale, I think. So, okay, that's full cash value. So I think in the real world, gosh, yeah, you could have two 40-year-old homes, and one's well-maintained and one's not. And so could they have the same market value? Well, as an economist, I would like to think not, because why would somebody pay the same amount for a really nice 40-year-old home and one that's pretty run down? But I don't know, maybe location, right? I don't know. So I know that's an obtuse way of trying to answer your question, which is, right now we have a taxable value construct, which is not full cash value except for land. It's the improvements are at replacement cost. Prior to the 1981 legislation, we were full cash value for everything. How that worked in terms of if assessors had to come in and say, yeah, I'm looking at this and I've got to take into account depreciation or obsolescence on those improvements to get to the value to which we'll attach the tax rate. I apologize, I don't have the ability, but I would argue that even if you went, you got potentially, if you got rid of depreciation but kept the current taxable value construct, which is improvements at replacement cost, and using the methodology that the assessors use to determine the replacement cost, would they still have to give consideration to obsolescence? Most likely for some of those homes, because if you go look at what the taxable value would then become and say, look, that's just more than their market value, because yeah, that's what it would cost to replace it. But since they haven't kept it up, got less value. If you would get rid of our current value construct and go to a pure market value, and I think you're going to add a lot of value. So I think you may have to give consideration to, assessors would still have to consider obsolescence. I think the legislature may also, as you heard Mr. Hobbs refer to, you would want to go reduce the tax rates, because if you were going to go from market value from taxable value to market value, it'd be such an increase in value, then you'd go, whoa, that's too much property tax, so we're going to lower the rate.
Right.
My last comment would be the house that was in the table, that's the actual house. You can see the taxable value in that house in FY23, the current tax year, that the taxable value before depreciation is approximately $428,000. The Z estimate for that house on Zillow is about $240,000 more than that. Just to give you an idea of the differential that can be between what one might consider market value, that is what it would sell for at full cash value, versus what it's valued at taxable value under our current statute. So I know that's that's a long-winded response.
Mr. Gendon and Assemblywoman Kasama, Dave Dolly is at the table up north. If I asked him if he could comment on your question, since Gendon referenced assessor, if you're okay with that, if you want to hear from him. I don't know if you do or not. Mr. Dolly?
I always like hearing from everybody.
Mr. Dolly?
The more the merrier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Gendon is absolutely correct in the fact that if we were to go with the market value, then more than likely we would have to use the obsolescence in order to lower it based on the actual maintenance or condition of the property itself. When you go with market value, you bring in a lot of other issues that other states have had. Mr. Gendon and I met with a couple legislators and assessors from the state of Idaho last year in the fact that they actually use a market value, but then they also use the replacement cost process in order to add new properties to the roll. They have a huge property tax debate going on up there and how they're trying to fix that whole issue. In California, they do it based on the market value, but they also do new improvements based on replacement cost. When you're dealing with that and you're dealing with the multitude of different types of properties and the transfers, if you were to do a sale, I mean, how would you do a market value sale for a corporation? I know for commercial businesses or for corporations, they sell shares of their company. And if there's not over 51% of the sale, then that property doesn't rebase, or the taxes wouldn't rebase on a market value because it's not the majority of the property. So when you're actually talking about going and switching to a market value system, I think that would cause more problems here in the state of Nevada, and it would be less fair and equitable for the taxpayers for both the residential and the commercial the commercial properties themselves. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mr. Dolly. Okay, so are there any additional questions from members? Assemblyman Hafen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Russell, for the presentation. I know that we're saying that if we remove the depreciation factor, the abatement, basically, it's zero as of today. But what happens in, let's say, 20 years from now, or 30 years from now, when the depreciation is now been removed? Would we then be looking at more tax revenue then than we would if we had kept the depreciation rate?
For the record, Russell Ginden with the fiscal. And again, I would offer to jump in after I'm done. But the honest answer is it's going to depend on each parcel and the improvements on that parcel in terms of the land and its value. Because what's going to happen if you did in my scenario, you reset depreciation to zero, you're going to get that increase in the value, and then you'll go forward off of that. So then most likely for a lot of the property, it would just result in significant and then increases in partial abatements, because you're going to increase the value up so much that then the tax would go up. But you could have, again, it's going to depend on the property, such that some of them, their taxes could go up depending on what's going on and what the assessor is going to have to say for that value, especially if you go to, say, some kind of downturn cycle where the values are coming down. And so then you could pick up additional taxes. But if you just, and I'm seeking more some about single family owner occupied homes, which would potentially be at the 3%, versus the non-single family owner and non-qualified rental, right? They could be at the 8% cap. So if you've got an 8% versus 3% cap and you get rid of depreciation or lower depreciation, then those properties could see more sustained increases in their property tax compared to, say, the homes at the 3%. But it's really hard to tell. But my gut check would be is potentially it just is going to increase the amount of partial abatements more than it would increase the revenue in the near term, possibly in the intermediate term and the longer term, just because of due to the nature of the partial abatements. And you especially for the older homes where you're going to add back 75% of the value, but not let the taxes go up, then that's going to, you saw in my tables, it creates a lot of partial abatement. And so, Mr. Dolly, I didn't know if that's an incorrect sort of thinking on my part, and yeah, you're welcome to counter.
I agree with Mr. Giddens. I think, yeah, it would cause a big problem. I was sitting here thinking maybe for new construction goes on the roll at 100%, and so, you know, you're still going to have the partial abatement. So as long as the costs are sufficient, but I think if you're talking about the existing homes that are older than the 50 years, then yeah, that would cause a huge abatement. So, yeah.
And I guess I would offer something that the answer to your question would depend on the age of the homes. That 1 or 2 year old homes, taking the depreciation on them will not result in such a significant increase in value as, say, 30, 40, 50, 60 year old homes. So for those homes, it may have little to no effect on their taxes in relation to what the assessor would do to their value, irrespective of the depreciation changing. But for the newer homes, you would increase their value. And thus, if their value was only supposed to go up 1% before, and thus their tax is 1%, but you change the depreciation and now they would go up, say, 10%, well, then their taxes would only go up another 2% from the 1% to the 3% cap. But so for that home that you added the 75% value, if they were only going to go up 1%, they could also go up an additional 2% to 3%. But you can see the bulk of that, their increase in value becomes partial abatements, versus for the younger homes, you'll add additional partial abatement, but possibly not as much. And so it's an interesting question. I may have to play around with some spreadsheets to see if I can simulate And if I do, I can share them with you, someone, as to what what could happen, and I would have.
So thank you for that, Mr. Gendon. While you're playing around and thinking about mathematical equations, I'm wondering what would be the effect if, for new construction, if we actually delayed that abatement that comes for that following year, and what would the numbers look like? I know you had, if you just eliminate the abatement, but what if there was a 3-year delay or 5-year delay of when that abatement kicked in on new construction, and counties were able to get the benefit of full value for 5 years? What would that math problem look like, and what would be the effect of that? That's what I'm wondering.
I don't know, because I'd have to think about that. But I would offer that the results would be very different across the 17 counties at the county level. Then the tax districts, say the cities or towns or special districts within the county, because if you happen to be in an area where there's a lot of new construction, when you decide to make this change to how they're going to be treated for the purposes of the partial abatement, then yeah, because new property statewide comes on at the full tax rate. And then the next year, they're eligible for any eligible for any partial abatements that are applicable to that property. But if you're going to delay them just for the new construction that came online in a particular fiscal year, okay, then that area that had a lot of that, they would get revenue and be able to keep getting revenues. Those that didn't wouldn't get much revenue. So it would have a very distortional effect on potentially the amount of revenue that would be generated by any of the entities imposing tax rates on those areas where there was a lot of new and not much new. But you can also see then you're really starting to create more distortions within the property taxes due based on the value of the property.
Madam Chairman, Dave Dolly.
Oh, go ahead.
Just what we're hearing is that there's an assumption that there is going to be an abatement the next year. There may not be an abatement. Most of the abatements that we're seeing now on new construction is the abatement on land itself. The improvements aren't really getting abated because they don't typically go up more than the 3% each year because we use the Marshall and Swift. That's what we have to use per law. But the majority of the abatement itself is on the land, so the improvements would not receive any kind of an abatement. So on down years, again, there would be no abatement automatically for the next year.
Okay. Listen, I appreciate this conversation. I know everybody wants to close this out, but I think ultimately, Mr. Dolly, before you sail on and say, I don't work here anymore, and Mr. Gendon, we should probably have a problem-solving session. But I think this has been a helpful conversation, and I hope for the members, you have some material to just kind of, play with and go back and forth on scenarios, because I do think we're going to get legislation that may enter into this space. And I think as legislators, we're going to be sitting in our seats in Carson City, and we will have to think through that policy once we see it in writing and determine what's best. And it's better to do it, to think through some challenges and issues now, so that when you see it in a bill, what you're really examining and analyzing before you vote on it or don't vote on it. That's what I think is the benefit of having these conversations right now. Is it's thought-provoking and it's helpful to problem solve. And Mr. Gendon, thank you again for doing awesome work on the charts. It's always really great information of things you didn't consider and now you should consider, and how you try to attack a problem around property tax. So with that, we will close out that presentation. Our next meeting will be sometime before the end of August. I want to remind members that if you have your BDR ideas for the interim, you need to turn them into fiscal, because we need to start having those conversations about what's going to be on the final list. And with that, we will go to agenda item number 10 and open up for public comment. BPS, is there anyone on the line? I'll go online.
Thank you, Chair. Your line is open and working, and you have no callers at this time.
Okay, is there anyone in Carson City? Seeing none, there's no one in Vegas. So we will go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and everybody have a really good week and weekend.
Excellent presentation, Chair. Thank you.